Welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Cancer moon as the Sect Light, I speak with the wonderful, brilliant astrologer Amaya Rourke. We spoke about the placement of Maya's moon in the ninth whole sign house, but also talked about many other things, from the absorption of pagan practices into early Christianity to the effects of the moon's cycles on marine animals' mating habits. We spoke about the myth of Hercules and the Hydra, and the way Cancer and Capricorn were viewed in ancient Egypt. We talked about Sleeping Beauty as a myth of the moon. We also discussed some of the differences between astrology and magic and other occult practices. Amaya spoke to her experience of the sensitivity that can accompany the Cancer moon and gave suggestions for navigating that, such as vagus nerve work and breath work. We discussed her Waxing Gibbous Moon phase, especially as it relates to constantly striving, as well as the effects of the moon being out of bounds. We also talked about the lot of fortune and profecting from different points, and how the secondary progressed moon can modulate the natal lunar placement. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and horary consultations in addition to a timing consult that I recently launched. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support so far. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Maya. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to her website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Amaya Rourke, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I had a little bit of a rough morning, but I'm really excited to have this conversation. It was really interesting. I was walking with my partner this morning, and like a lot of the times I can be nervous before a recording, and today I was a little bit nervous, but the uh, overarching feeling was kind of just excitement to talk to you. So yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I'm grateful that you said yes to come on.
Oh, I feel really honored by that. I hope I make you feel comfortable. That's what a Cancer moon dreams of, right?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, and I have my Jupiter in Cancer, so we got some like Jupiter moon synastry going on, so hopefully that helps a little bit.
I think so. Well, thank you for having me on here. I always get nervous before everything. I think it's
Mm,
a consequence of the moon phase that my moon is in.
mm.
And so I spent the whole week studying because that gives me a false sense of security.
I know how that goes. Yeah, has what's been going on with you with like the recent astrology, anything in particular?
Well, it's my Jupiter return. And
Oh,
so,
congratulations.
yeah, thank you. It's not, I mean, it hasn't technically happened. We won't have a conjunction until like way later this year. I think actually next year, like the beginning of next year.
Hmm.
Um, but I felt it the minute it moved in. I was like, oh, hello, my love.
Amazing.
I'm not a huge fan of Aries transits. It makes a lot of squares in my chart. And so it was really nice to feel that come in and like
Mm.
suddenly make a lot of beautiful synastry. And I was like, oh, this is nice. I
Oh,
appreciate this.
that's wonderful. And I know that you're a student of Sam Reynolds, and he talks about Jupiter as kind of like the match funder. Do you feel like you've done that Jupiter work to gain the rewards of the Jupiter return, or how do you think about the Jupiter return?
That's a good question. And I'm so hesitant to say yes to that because I feel like that's when you get smacked.
Right.
But, I've been doing this work as an astrologer now professionally and as my only kind of gig for, oh my gosh, since 2019.
Hmm.
So I feel like I've done a lot of work in figuring out what my practice is about, which is very Jupiter. Jupiter is the exalted ruler of my ninth house. So it's kind of important to figure
Mm.
out the why and the meaning. It's in my seventh house. So I've been in a relationship for 10 years and It's going well. There's some changes
Lovely.
that happen around 10 years, but I think that we've done a lot of work leading up to this point
Mm,
to get there. And it rules my fifth house. So a lot of stuff around, for me, it's creativity and pleasure. That's also going through a bit of a shift and being redefined, actually simplified in true kind of like earth sign fashion. It's like,
mm,
let's narrow this. Let's get a little bit more to the point, right?
mm. Amazing. Interesting. Do you feel like the Venus as your exaltation lord of your fifth, and the kind of retrograde cycle she's kind of moving into, do you think that plays into that at all as well?
Oh, probably, yeah. Not to mention that they're square one another.
Mm,
So kind of testing out those values and how they're made
mm,
manifest in a much more tangible philosophical manner.
yeah.
I would say that that's pretty spot on.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, can you just give us a little bit more of an introduction to yourself and your practice? And, I know I already mentioned Sam, but your teachers and, influences that you've had.
Sure. I'm Amaya Rourke, if you didn't hear my name earlier. I'm a professional astrologer and I I take an animistic approach to astrology that is also somewhat mystical. I've done a lot of different things in my practice. I have learned firsthand from Sam Reynolds. He was one of my mentors, but I do a lot of self-study just because I live in a different country. It's hard to get classes like during my time zone. So a lot of self-study with various different people that offer their recorded classes like Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees and Chris Brennan. And I definitely have put a lot of focus, particularly on learning more of the Hellenistic astrology. I found a bit of a home there. And then in 2016, I had a little bit of a existential crisis while looking for a star in the sky, thinking it would be somewhere else. And that led me to learning how to do parentolenta, which is a method that was reconstructed by Bernadette Brady. And honestly, I feel like I should have studied with her, but she has sadly passed away. And that's
Mm,
Diana Rosenberg, probably my biggest influence in the star work I've done for several years. She wrote an amazing 2-volume set called Secrets of the Ancient Skies, 1,600 pages on just
amazing.
fixed stars. I mean, like literally her opus. She did that while she had cancer. This was her swan
Wow.
song.
Mm,
And everyone asks me, where do I get that? Because I love it so much. I'll talk to you about it for hours. And I'm like, literally, her family still self-publishes it. You have to get it on eBay. That's the only place you can
mm.
buy this book, which is a real pity. I wish a publishing company would pick it up. And like the only thing I would ask, my only wish list item is please make an index for this book. She didn't have time to do it, but that doesn't matter. It's amazing. Highly recommend it. But that's kind of been my trajectory. I've had a bit of an obsession with the fixed stars for a while. And then the moon was like, hello, knock, knock, knock. Do you remember
Mm.
me, the domicile Sect Light ruler of your entire chart? Yeah, we got to talk. And so that led me to making a change there. And now I'm Moon Haven Astrology.
Amazing. And what kind of moon focused offerings do you have now? I know that you're kind of retiring the fixed star parents reading that you've been doing. So what are you
So
moving into?
I am doing a reading called Lunar Rhythms, and this reading is all about learning about your moon, which could honestly be stretched out into like 6 readings. I
Mm,
try to find the best way to prioritize for my clients based off of what they personally say that they're struggling or would like to know more about. But the moon has so many different implications in the chart, and it really has such a huge impact to learn how to work with your natal moon as well as your secondary progressed moon
hmm.
and kind of how that impacts your life on an embodied level, on a kind of like day-to-day level. A lot of people, I think, today are struggling a lot with, well, burnout, to be quite frank. I think we're
Yeah.
all stretched to the limit,
Mm,
and coming back into working with the moon helps us to kind of combat that. I like to think of it animistically as kind of like the moon is the original self. It's both the animal self, but also the mind, because the body was the mind. In fact,
mm,
the body forms the mind. And so I don't see it separated so much as kind of like the underlying mechanism of it. If you don't sleep or eat or take care of yourself, the first thing that's impacted is your mental acuity. And so a lot of the work that I do with my clients has to do with the fact that they are struggling and they don't know how to live within their lunar rhythm. And that's why they feel burnt out on top of capitalism, colonialism, and everything else we have going on. It's like often they'll make agreements or they'll say yes to things that they shouldn't, and they don't realize why it feels so bad because we are not taught to prioritize those body feelings as a form of information. And so I've been very lucky to work with some clients on this so far. Obviously, with me finishing off the fixed star stuff, it's been a rush of like too many people asking for fixed star readings because it ends at the end of this month. But I'm looking forward to getting back to everything lunar because I have basically fallen head over heels like I do into a research rabbit hole that makes me fall in love with everything. And I'm just so happy to be able to talk to you about it. I'm nerding out when I'm talking too much. I can feel it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's too much at all. I'm super excited to, talk about this moon stuff. And I think that, you're just reminding me of how, at least in medieval Islamic astrology, the moon represents like the people more broadly. And I feel like they're, I don't know how to tie this in to like an astrological transit or what have you, but I do feel like over the last few years through the pandemic and everything, like we all just are in a place where there's so much pain, I think, stored in our bodies and so much like unresolved stuff. And, I'm happy to be doing just my little part to kind of talk about the moon and focus on the moon because I do think that like these kinds of moon focuses are really important in our times to really get in touch with our bodies and the wisdom that our bodies have. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you for the work that you're doing leading up to this. My homework was to listen to a bunch of episodes of your podcast, and it was like such a joy.
Oh, awesome. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah, so it's interesting because we don't really know each other super well. You're friends with my partner, and that's kind of like how we have a little bit of a personal connection. But we were just talking before with my partner about how like she doesn't even really talk about me with you a lot. And so like we're really kind of having a conversation for the first time today, like meeting today, even though we've interacted like a little bit here and there on, Instagram and Twitter and stuff like that.
Yeah, we don't know each other, but I feel like that is a problem with me because I have a real hard time with reaching out to people. And I've been watching everything you're doing, and obviously your partner and I are friends, and I don't ask questions either. I think it's because I'm a Scorpio rising. I'll be like, ooh, that's invading someone's privacy. So I won't like ask anything. And I also won't be like, hello, hi, can I be your friend? So I'm really thrilled to actually be talking with you because otherwise it would probably take a lot longer to happen.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know if it's okay if I say the country that you live in.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Maybe when we like go to Ireland and visit you, like that probably would have been the first time. But yeah, I was actually curious because I know of a few people from Ireland that are on like Astro Twitter, but is there much of a community, an astrological community in Ireland?
Not that I am aware of. I actually met my first like astro friend not too long ago, like a month ago in person. We've been talking for a while. They live down in Cork and I live up near Sligo. So those are kind of like opposite sides of Ireland. And we finally met up because they had some work stuff up here and it was just glorious. But I even tried at one point, I had a whole bunch of books, like old kind of modern books. I started off as a modern astrologer before I became a Hellenistic astrologer. And I had all these books that I wanted to donate because I wasn't using them anymore. And I have a bit of a book problem. So I've got an agreement with myself that if it starts to be too much for the bookshelves I already have, that it's time to do a culling. And I tried to contact the astrological organization here and like nobody responded to me. And I tried several different ways. And I was like, either they don't exist anymore, or maybe they think that I'm spam. I don't know. But I have not met or talked to a bunch of people here that are into it. I would say the problem is people here probably are not the people to buy those sort of things from us. They definitely are very, how do I want to say it? They're very particular with how they spend their money here. And I think
Interesting.
that that's kind of a consequence of a lot of the kind of trauma that Ireland has been through as far as
Mm,
resourcing is concerned.
mm,
But it was pretty notable from the first day that I moved here back in like 2017, how many times I'd be buying something and someone at the cash register who's checking me out, even in small shops, would be like, "Oh, this is just so pricey. Do you want me to go change this for you?" I have Venus and Capricorn. The answer is no. No, I don't want you to change it for me. I
mm,
want exactly that. But that happens to this day, even with people I've known for a long time.
mhm,
And spending a few $100s on like a reading is probably outside of what someone would consider to be a wise use of money, even if it could be quite helpful.
mhm. So interesting. My family is historically from Ireland. I mean, I'm third generation American, Irish American, and my family is actually from Mayo, which is just south of Sligo. And I have this real challenging thing with owning things. And like I've kind of attributed it to my Capricorn stellium in the second house with Saturn there. But I do think that there really probably is something ancestral about just like, especially Mayo is considered, I don't know about now, but I think historically, like I've seen like political cartoons where they kind of consider that like just like a poor farm place. And so during the famine, like a lot of people passed in that area, unfortunately, because there's just so few resources. It was like, and so anyway, I feel like there's probably, I'm having like an ancestral resonance with that. But yeah, it's really interesting how those things can just affect something as like prosaic as consumer behavior, you know?
I agree, though. I also have that Capricorn stellium, but mine's in the third house, and it
Mm,
disposits almost everything in my chart except for my moon.
mm.
And I have a really hard time with accumulation of anything, which is why I have the book rule. Most people
Oh,
just go buy
nice.
more bookshelves,
Yeah.
right? And I'm like, no, but what if? Like, that's a lot of stuff, right? And I go through like probably 4 times a year some sort of culling in the house where everything has to be cleaned out. I have to really examine what I own or what I don't, like use and don't use. And then I will give stuff to charity or I'll send it to friends or I'll sell it because it starts to weird me out. If I honestly got to a point for a while where if I couldn't live out of a backpack,
Oh my
I
gosh.
didn't feel good. Like it
I say,
made
oh
me
my
feel
gosh,
sick.
because I resonate with that,
Oh my God.
somehow, or it's just like too much stuff. I'm just like, oh, I can't flee in the night. You know what I mean? Like it is really like a weird, which feels kind of, yeah, ancestrally resonant in a
It's like
sense.
I don't have any like memory of needing to do that, growing up.
Hmm.
I have other
Hmm.
memories that are, challenging, but not that. So
Yeah.
it is a strange thing because I've not seen the rest of my family act that way.
Nor actually like my dad kind of had like he just was a craftsperson, so there was just a lot of like wood carvings around, like little figurines and just like a lot of stuff around the house. And like I had a relatively stable childhood in terms of like we had stuff and I had a pretty like I was, I had a home, we didn't move around a lot, anything like that. And so it's like, yeah, there's no real reason why I can point to in my upbringing that I'm like this, but for some reason, yeah.
Well, at least we examine what we're doing with the things that we own, which I don't feel are really things. They're other people, right? They're
Mm,
non-human people. And so
yeah.
I feel something I had to get over is for a while, I didn't want to damage any of my stuff. I felt like if I
Mm,
damaged it, which meant like any kind of evidence of use,
yeah.
that I wasn't respecting it. Not this is way before I realized I was an animist. And I had to get over that and start kind of retraining my brain to
Mm,
be like, no use, the existence or the evidence of use is the patina of love, is what I had to start
mm,
telling myself. And I think it's beautiful that you grew up with someone who was making all these things out of wood, because what a way to express love and creativity in the world. But I had to kind of get over that and be like, no, it's okay. I actually have, still to this day, I have some books I had read a few times where I literally would just be sitting there barely cracking it open because I didn't want to crack the spine. I would be
mm,
careful with what was on my hands. I wouldn't make any marks in it. These books would look practically brand new, like you just got them from the store.
mhm,
And I had to kind of brute force myself out of that. where I'd be like, okay, we can use pencil and we can underline. And that's what I've kind of come to now is like highlighters are expensive and I underline too much stuff. So it's a pencil. And then if it's worst case, if I start to feel guilty or if I want to sell it or whatever, I can just erase it. Like, it's not the end of the world, but it is a strange thing. And I do wonder sometimes if it does have something to do with that kind of polarity between Capricorn and Cancer. Because I have this stellium in Capricorn like you do, and then I have the moon in Cancer. And those are the two most dignified planets in my chart too.
Right.
And like Cancer, I feel is okay with stuff, but I feel like maybe it's the Capricorn that's like not so much, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think a lot about that. As I said, like I have Jupiter in Cancer, and so I have my ascendant ruler, and then Saturn is one of the most dignified planets in my chart as well, and they're opposite each other. And so I do think a lot about Capricorn Cancer tension, and it's just interesting to hear you think about it, in different houses in your chart, so different topics in your life and some different planets involved, but that same kind of like oppositional challenge that is an opportunity, an opportunity for some kind of integration. Do you want to talk a little bit about animism? I feel like we have talked about it a little bit in a past episode, but it might be good to just get a sense of your take on what that term means.
Well, I know that Diana and our friend Pallas call their astrology relational astrology. And I think that that's a good way to describe it, but I tend to be a little timid about using other people's terminology. So that's what it really boils down to. It's the idea that the world around you is alive and also has a soul. And that you are in relationship with the world, regardless of your awareness of it or not. And so the most responsible thing we can do is to become aware of that relationship and to learn how to be in healthy relationship with the world, which can range. And I think that that's something that people might not fully understand. There's nuance to this. For example, my relationship to a shark is not going to be the same as my relationship to my dog, right? And it's about learning. It's just like you can't be friends with everybody, but that doesn't mean you can't respect everybody.
Right.
And this idea that we're living in a relational world kind of changes the way in which we function in the world, because if it's not there to be exploited and it's not there just to for our own function and use, then we might be thinking a little differently about how we operate and how we kind of move in our day-to-day lives so that we can live in greater harmony would be my hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the assertion and the prioritization of another being's beingness or personhood, their subjectivity, them being a subject rather than like an object for our use. And I think we can think about kind of like inanimate objects that way. But I know within animism, there's even like an idea of ensouling of these kind of things that we consider in our everyday life as objects. And so I appreciate the kind of, I think that in the hopefully late stage capitalism world that we live in, there is this kind of objectification that can kind of permeate our lives because that is the construct of capitalism. And so I think that prioritizing subjectivity is super important.
Yes, I agree, because I would agree with you in this way, particularly the idea that we're objectifying everything includes one another, includes ourselves. I think that our obsession with trying to look a certain way, I think that's one of the things that scares me a lot when I go onto places like Instagram and TikTok and see young people, getting fillers because they don't want any evidence at all of any kind of age. And the fact that we're spending more money on things that didn't matter as much to us, or maybe weren't as available to us as much, mostly because we want to be seen a certain way, proves that we are objectifying ourselves even. And that makes me sad. That makes me sad for the people that live that way. It also makes me sad for our world, because then that becomes the top priority, is that if you become an object of desire for yourself in a way that's unhealthy, then it's going to supersede any kind of moral questioning as to whether it's good to do these things on a more global scale outside of yourself.
Mm.
And I think that we're in a crisis because it doesn't make us happier.
Mm.
It doesn't make us healthier. It's making us more neurotic, and I would even say causing a mental health collapse.
Mm.
And that's reflecting the ecological collapse that we're in. And so animism can be a really good way to combat that, because it's hard not to fall into that. It's
Mm-hmm.
really, really hard not to fall into that when we are in a kind of an age of image.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I had to start thinking about again with the idea of the things that I own, which aren't really things, they're beings, is am I worshiping the image or am I in relationship with the being?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between the two. You know, am I worshiping the image of, we'll say, intelligence by keeping my books pristine?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I in relationship with the being because I'm willing to write in them and underline them and make good use in not a kind of like a exploitative way, but in a correlational way, co-creative way with the object or person that I am with.
Yeah, I think books are a great example because I personally love marginalia, and I think the rise of like people being really into vintage stuff is kind of a corollary in a kind of way to what we're talking about, where people are trying to interact with like clothes in a different way, in a more kind of like, I don't know, authentic, or treating the shirt as like having its own life kind of thing. And it's really cool when I buy a used book that has marginalia in it, because I love writing in the margins of my books, where it's like you see the life of that person overlapping with the life of the book in the conversation that's happening, and like you get to be a part of that conversation. And so yeah, I really appreciate that, especially in reference to books and the kind of like life that books have, and that we get to be a part of, be in relationship with, make a part of our own lives.
Absolutely. It's kind of like this might be super nerdy or really nostalgic or I don't know, sappy, I don't know, Cancer Moon stuff. But I just got this book all about sea lore for Ireland here. And inside, I bought it used. I try to buy used when I can. Inside was a photograph of these two men, and on the back, it was like my best friend and co-sailor. And then like I just sat and like teared up, and I was like, oh my God. Like, so this isn't just a book about sailing lore. It was given to a sailor who was, I guess, in love with his best friend. And I got to receive the evidence of that and be in the presence of that. And it kind of makes me think about how we used to value objects a lot more because you knew everything that went into making it and you knew who made it.
Yeah.
And we don't have that anymore. It's completely depersonalized and dehumanized. It was something I'm obsessed with, is kind of like the what's it called? The Luddite movement.
Yeah.
Which actually segs into the myth that I want to talk to you about.
Wonderful.
Regarding the moon. But you know, the Luddite movement became really pronounced because the spinning and weaving guild in the United Kingdom was being replaced by machines. And that's when they lost it, because this was an ages and ages long trade that was passed down from, you know, family to family, from family member to family member. And there were trade secrets and superstitions. It was like a religion in a sense, which is actually an interesting corollary, because most of our art was probably the beginning of religion and they're intertwined, right? And so they didn't just lose their livelihood by being replaced by the Industrial Revolution. They actually were losing an entire culture. And they were losing something that was precious within their family, this kind of connection. And it's something I think about all the time, is like, wow, it's very true. It's one of the reasons I like to purchase from small businesses, particularly, you know, people who are craftsmen, because I'll know who made it and I can ask questions about what it took. And most of them are just eager to talk to you about like let me tell you about where I sourced this from, right? And I am such a nerd about that because I feel like we're losing that at this point when you can just click a button and buy anything without having to see someone face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, wow. I feel like we could probably go on for an
We
hour
could.
or two about, yeah, about this. But yeah, I'd love to return to focus on the moon. And to start with that, I just want to get a sense. I also just want to give a shout out to Justin Plunkett because you were on his podcast within the last few months. And it was a really great episode. You talk a lot about your childhood in that, and I found that to be really fascinating. So if people want to get more information about that, like I feel like that's a really great listen. But I was just curious because I don't think you addressed this in that episode. I imagine you had a kind of relationship with the moon when you were a child because you had this really strong relationship with nature and like the forest where you lived, if that's the correct term. And I'm just curious, like, if you could tell us a little bit about that, and maybe if you didn't have an explicit relationship with the moon, if there's like some moment that you remember of like coming into consciousness of this thing in the sky that revolves around all of us.
Yeah. When I was really small, definitely was not focused on the sky. It was dangerous to be outside at night where I lived. And
Okay.
so I didn't get to go out unless my parents, like that was kind of like the strict rule. And it was one that rarely, it's one of the rare ones where I was like, okay, I'll do what you say. I didn't really question that one too much, just because the forest goes from being something really magical in the day to being something terrifying at night, which is why we have so many myths around that.
Right.
But that was particularly true because, there were wild animals where I lived. And so you especially didn't go out at night because that's when your senses as a human being are not really up to par with the environment. I do remember distinctly when I started to kind of think more about the sky, which was probably around age 9 or 10. And my mom she was kind of my entrance into the natural world because she had, I think, out of boredom, an obsession with the natural world. Like we had like every National Geographic in our house, and because of the kind of very restrictive religion that we had, like we were allowed to watch a lot of documentaries, but not much else.
Okay.
And so she was a super nerd. And she got us into like kind of looking up at the sky, and she taught me about our first constellations. And when we moved to Phoenix, I lived in Wyoming for a good part of my childhood, and when I was reaching puberty, I moved to Phoenix, which actually is where I was born. It's kind of a funny, weird, kind of twisty lunar thing. Where I moved a lot when I was a kid. And when we moved back to Phoenix, my mom was gifted passes to the science museum there, which is actually one of the better science museums you can go to. It's got a planetarium and and that was my favorite thing, was the planetarium.
Cool.
I became kind of obsessed. And I remember seeing my first ever solar eclipse. I can't remember the exact age, but I remember we had a trampoline, and we lived kind of out in the middle of nowhere again. That's very much my dad, who is a Cancer sun. He was like, nope, no cities for me. And I was allowed to go out at night there, and I was laying on the trampoline and I saw this supermoon that was bright red. And when I say supermoon, I mean like I was like, holy cow. I actually had been watching a bunch of like apocalyptic movies with my parents, and I was just like, is the world ending? Like, what is happening right now? But I was totally entranced. And my mom made me join the Girl Scouts. And I became really, thankfully, my troop. If you ever talk to other people who are in the Girl Scouts, it's kind of a varied experience. It's not like the Boy Scouts where it's like really focused on like wilderness skills. Girl Scouts can be a whole range of things. There's like a lot of like charity. You can go and learn things in businesses, things like that. My mom made me join, and she was like, no, that's boring. We're not going to Build-A-Bear to learn about how they build bears. You're going to learn how to camp. And we're going to learn how to do things like navigating by the stars. And that's what I did. All the way, I was a Girl Scout until I was like 17 or 18. I got my silver award. Did not go as far as my gold. If anyone knows what that is, thank you, fellow nerds. We're here for it. I imprinted with a Boy Scout troop for a bit. I was a camp counselor. I did a lot of that kind of stuff, but I was always outside. And because of the difference, I will say Phoenix has some great, especially if you're on the outer edges like I was, some really great ability to see the night sky. Deserts are really good for that. Not my favorite environments. I definitely love forests a hell of a lot more, but if you want to go see some stars, going out in the desert is really the place to do it. And I started paying more attention to what was going on with the moon after that eclipse. And so from there, I was a super nerd. I went to like the Intel summer science camp. I got a scholarship for that a couple years in a row. And I started learning about it with marine science. I also got a scholarship to do some stuff with like SeaWorld and the Girl Scouts and learn about how marine animals are actually highly impacted by moon cycles. That's something that has been well tracked and traced. Fish, as far as like fertility goes and how they will spawn and breed and things like that, highly, highly impacted by the moon. And of course, you've got the tides. And so became a huger force in my life. I feel like my early life was much more like the moon is Artemis. And my later life became much bigger in the sense of like maybe like Selene or Selene, right? In that looking at the sky.
Yeah, for people who might not understand what that shorthand means, would you mind just like elaborating a little bit on that transition?
So there's a lot of different goddesses attributed to the moon in Greek myth. And Artemis is probably, otherwise known as Diana by the Romans, is one of the more well-known lunar goddesses. She's the goddess of the wild. Just fun fact here, my mom's name is Diana. So
and what's funny is that Diana Rose Harper on this podcast talked about the myth of Artemis. So if people want to hear about that, they can go back to that episode.
And there's so much to that most people don't know this. The cult of Artemis was like one of the biggest cults in not just the Greek world. It then superseded the Greek world. It superseded the Roman world and stuck around when they started Christianizing everything to the point that like it's actually mentioned in the Bible.
Oh, wow.
Most people don't realize this. She actually changed the way that worship happened in Greek culture. So that's a very lunar thing to be like, here, have a sprinkle of change, a lot of change.
And I wonder, not to get in the weeds on Christianity, but I wonder if, at least in Catholicism, I grew up Catholic, and there's like people love Mary so much, and I wonder if part of that has to do, because a lot of the early Christian church was just like taking pagan practices that already existed and co-opting them. So, but it was like, and throwing in Jesus. So it's like the fact that we have Christmas has to do with the solstice. Easter has to do with the spring equinox, I believe, and like pagan holidays associated with those times. And so, it's just interesting. Like there's you mentioned art earlier, and I know in early Christian art, there's a lot of like, you'll see libation pouring in early Christian art, which doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, but is like an earlier pre-Christian practice that gets kind of brought into the early art. So it's super interesting.
I think Mary was an amalgamation of so many different goddesses. But my fun obscure fact about that is another cult that was huge that most people don't know about is the Dioscorides, which is the twins of Castor and Pollux. And they were so popular that they're actually also mentioned again in the Bible because they couldn't get rid of this cult. And instead of making them evil, because the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was considered evil, the Dioscorides get kind of folded into Christianity quietly, and they show up in early iconography everywhere. You'll see like the 12 disciples and Jesus, and then these two other random dudes, and it's them, okay? So yeah, I have a lot about that. My parents are both ministers, so won't go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, Artemis would have been like, she was considered to be the goddess of the wild. And she's the one I relate to the most, that's for sure. I have Capella as my heliacal setting star, and that was a star that was aligned for a temple. So it's one that I deeply relate to, Artemis particularly. But then later in life would have been more like Selene. And Selene was, some people call it Selene. Who knows? It's Greek. I don't speak Greek, but I try my best here.
We're doing our best, you know.
We're just doing our best. She was considered the Titanic or pre-Olympian personification of the moon. So this is a little bit of a differentiation. There's a lot of goddesses that are related to the moon, but the actual personification of the moon was Selene. And she has her own Orphic hymn, just like Artemis has her own Orphic hymn, just like a number of the other goddesses associated with the moon has an Orphic hymn. But the one that we use for divination is, or not divination, but more for devotion, is usually the hymn to Selene, because Selene is more of the goddess of the moon, or the personification of the moon. Which, if you want a great translation of that, I'm going to plug Kristen Mathis here. I just got done restudying her part 1, and I'm like, give me more, Kristen. Give me more.
Yeah, we'll throw her Substack into the show notes. And also, if people just want to go back on this podcast to the introductory episode, a different translation by Sarah Mastros. Sarah was kind enough to let me read the Orphic hymn to Selene on that intro episode, so people can go back and listen to that as well. But I know Kristen has some, like, she's doing some amazing stuff with the Orphic hymns where she's like really kind of deconstructing it and kind of explaining it in ways that I don't know a ton about the Orphic hymns actually, but like it seems what she's doing is really impactful and important.
Yeah, because she is one of the few people that has kind of like the triple threat going on, where she has an occultic background, like a magical background, and then she has a classics background, and she's also an astrologer. So you don't usually get someone who's all three.
Right.
And so she's actually able to decode it, particularly the kind of anthropological animistic origins and descriptions, but then she's also able to link back in with the astrology into the mythology in a way that I've not seen anybody do. So I will say Sarah Mastro's hymn is absolutely beautiful. One of the best, like, as far as prettiness goes, as far as the kind of the sound of it and the reverence of it. I think Mastros has really nailed that. But if you want to see more of the background behind the meaning and like what that would have meant, particularly for the Orphic mysteries, which underlie a lot of astrology, then Kristen's work, I think, is absolutely invaluable right now.
Awesome. Wonderful. Yeah. And you spoke about your love of like the moon's effect on the natural world. And I was just wondering if you knew, just like, you know, people talk about the moon and the tides and stuff, but do you have like one maybe scientific fact that people might not know that's like a way that the moon affects sea animals? Because I think it's so interesting how like we are animals as well, and we have this like relationship with water that's very special, but we don't have the kind of like living and breathing water that maybe fish or like kind of just sea animals have. So I'm curious if like anything comes to mind there.
Oh man. I think the most fascinating thing is that the ancients said that usually the new moon and the full moon were not times to like perform acts of magic, right? Because these were like live wires. They're too much energy, right? What's funny is that this also correlates to like different breeding habits of particular marine animals. We see this with fish and we see this with mollusks a lot, where actually they peak. We basically reaching up to like the waxing gibbous. That's when you see like the most kind of like breeding or laying of eggs and stuff. And then it's like they kind of black out during the full moon. And then we have more activity again at the waning moon. And it's one of those things where that has kind of crossed over. It constantly goes through my mind like on a loop when people ask me things about, you know, magic as part of my practice, has long time been kind of involved with the occultic side of this. And they're like, should I do this at a new moon or a full moon? And I'm like, nope. If the animals will not have sex at that time, we should not be doing things either. It's basically like the eclipses are the most extreme version of that. But this is still happening on a monthly basis where like these are time periods to like rest or to enjoy each other's company, but maybe not to be trying to overextend ourselves, because I find that fascinating. Why would an animal stop at the peak of the moon, particularly? There's the most light, right? We obviously see a lot of like what we call lunacy behavior with animals. Eclipse facts is something I've been digging deep into, and it's like, oh my gosh, like for bees are something I'm also obsessed with. when an eclipse happens, they all go, and this is very typical of a lot of animals, they go inside their hive thinking that it's night. But the
Mm.
difference with bees, unlike birds will kind of like, they'll have their twilight song when the eclipse first starts happening, and they'll go into their nest and they start to sleep, or pretending to
Mm.
sleep, I guess, because it's only a few minutes. And then they'll have their dawn song when the eclipse ends, as if the day has started again, and they go
Oh,
back about their
wow.
day, right? But bees are different. Bees don't do that. What
Mm.
bees do is they go inside of their hives, and then they send one ranger out to
Mm.
check things out. And then when he returns, almost every single time, they will not come back out of the hive for the rest of the day.
Oh, wow.
It's a total disruption to them. And they're like, nah, we're good. No Baleful race for us. We're chilling. Like,
Wow, that is fascinating. It's so interesting to hear just like, because I feel like animals just know, like obviously like I said, like we're animals as well, but I feel, it's like if it's gonna like a natural disaster is gonna hit or like some things are happening, it's just like there is this instinctual knowledge I feel like that animals can often have, and so it's just really interesting to hear the different ways that these kind of subtle changes, subtle or maybe not so subtle changes, like impact their behavior in like very tangible ways.
you've been writing up an eclipse guide, which I was supposed to put out at the last eclipse, but eclipses don't work like that. So
Mm.
but there's so much I started to pack in there about like how the eclipses particularly really impact our natural world, and that we should pay attention to that because we are a part of the natural world. And not to like
Absolutely.
fear monger, but to be like, hey, like there's cycles of rest and there's cycles of activity, and this is one where we should be resting because things are already happening in our literally in our atmosphere that disrupt things. And then you've got how animals will act and like what it does to our world, and kind of, yeah, we're part of that, so maybe let's just go take a nap and watch some Netflix and chill.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that that's a really beautiful thing that being attuned to the moon, just thinking about the moon can really do. Again, not to like continue to be super anti-cap on the astrology podcast here, but like I feel like our society generally doesn't offer us seasonality. Like it's just kind of
No.
like work through the winter, work, 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 just keep working. And like that's not how humans have historically operated, like this kind of modern time that we're in is actually relatively short in terms of overall human history. And like historically, we are seasonal creatures, just like every other thing that's a part of nature. And so it,
100%.
yeah, I think being attuned to that and like noticing that and being like, yeah, there's an eclipse, I'm going to rest, or yeah, the moon is void, I'm going to rest, is like super, super helpful for me at least.
Yeah, I think that it's a good way for us. I think some of it we can't avoid. For example, if you have a 9 to 5 and it demands you work at
Hmm.
certain times, and you've got to pay your bills, that's
Yeah,
capitalism for you, right? So like,
totally.
I'm not telling you to like call out every single time something's happening with the moon, but what I am saying is like you can attune your own rhythm within whatever is in your power and your agency, to saying yes and no to certain things, and to giving yourself a lot more leeway, because on top of having to work so much, we also will just pack things in.
Mm.
And that's something I think about a lot, is like when I was a kid, I didn't try to like do everything every single day.
Mm.
And we've been sold a lie about this idea that we can have it all and be it all and do it all. And I'm like, how? We are one body. We are one
Right.
body with one life. You are going to have to make trade-offs. No one wants to talk about that part. And if we pay attention to the moon in our charts, it can help us with making trade-offs that are happier and more satisfying to
Mm.
our lives. Particularly that feels more at home. I think that a sense of home has a lot to do with how you are treating yourself.
Mm. Absolutely. And I feel like it speaks to the moon's rulership of Cancer, which is a sign that's like often associated with the home, like home and hearth.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, you've talked a lot about the moon as like it relates to as you relate to it today, like with the references to Selene. But I'm just curious if there's anything else that you have to say about that, and if like you want to comment about like the moon's general importance in thinking astrologically or having an astrological practice.
Oh man. So without intending to, on a personal basis, on the occult side of my practice, like I've always been involved with lunar goddesses. It wasn't on purpose. I feel like for me, I won't speak for everyone, that the divinity that wants my attention, the divine that wants my attention, chooses me and not the other way around. Um, and that's how it's always kind of gone. So for a while, I had a very intense practice with Hecate, who is another moon goddess. Um, and it's ironic because like in my early 20s, when I was very atheistic and like I went through like this intense, like no religion, no spirituality, no nothing. My friends who were also like philosophical atheists, like I was, would they gave me the nickname Artemis for like years. And it wasn't because I was like, I know a lot of baby witches, as we call them, people who are just starting, will like kind of like be like, Artemis. It wasn't like that. I literally was like, none of that. But they loved that I really would defend people within my little nerd community against jerks. And I would take in the newbies and be nice and friendly to them and things like that. And so that just kind of earned me that nickname. And now today, my practice is highly influenced by this relationship I have with the moon, as I see her as Artemis, as well as another Irish deity who it's not a firm correspondence, but it's definitely implied when you start to like translate the words used for Irish astronomy, which is the Kayach. Some people may read that as Kalich. That's not how you say it, but that's okay. There's a lot of different ways to say it because there's like 3 different versions of Gaelic or Galagay that you can use. I know that in like Britain it would be the Calyx, but you know, she's this kind of hag figure, and she's what I consider one of my patron divinities that I work with, and I work with Artemis very extensively, and it's never been something I do on purpose because I tend to be kind of shy about that stuff just as much as I am with humans, where I'm like, you look cool, but I'm not going to say anything to you. It's more like they come knocking and they come knocking and they come knocking. Even Medusa, who, you know, the kind of joke, the running joke is that I'm algal mommy because I have algal freaking everywhere in my chart. She actually, that star is not really a star. It's a binary, actually triple star system, but binary eclipsing system particularly, which had implications of the moon. And so even the Egyptians like would choose things based off of the eclipsing system of this star for like if it was lucky or not, relating back to fate, which is something that the moon had a lot of say over in the ancient world, no matter what culture you go to. And so just kind of keeps going like that, where it's like reflections and refractions of like, and here's another face of the moon. Because I do believe that a lot of what we're seeing all these different gods and goddesses and divinities, is what the Egyptians saw, which is decans or faces. This idea that you cannot see divinity in its whole form, or it would melt the meat off of your bones, right? And so we see it as fractals. And I also believe that the fractal that we see is a reflection of culture, time, and place. And that's why we will get similar myths in different parts of the world that have distinct differentiations that are regional to where they came from. But you'll be like, oh, there's a moon goddess here, and here's a moon god here. And like, wow, how many of these lunar gods and goddesses spin thread and weave? Like almost all of them. Isn't that weird? All around the world. And things like that. So it's become a really central part, and it has been a central part of my personal beliefs and practice. Definitely my magical practice. I prioritize the moon over basically everything. I do more lunar elections for myself than just about anything else as far as like choosing times, dates, and places. Changing my practice name to Moonhaven Astrology was because the moon kept giving me dreams about you need to do this. And it was like inside of this cave at the ocean, this moonlight was streaming in, and it was like, okay, fine. But yeah, it's central, I think, to my life. I mean, I wake up and do devotion with the moon every single day, not just on Mondays. So it's a pretty resounding thing in my life.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing. I'm curious just because like I've actually started doing candle magic from, I think, your candle magic course. And I found that doing candle magic with the moon has felt for me the most hit you over the head, kind of like, wow, this is working. Like I can see this manifesting kind of right before my eyes. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit about your experience of that, like perhaps in relation to doing magic with other beings.
Yes. So the moon, as you probably know, was considered the generatrix or the mediatrix in ancient astrology, but that ancient astrology wasn't just for mundane matters, that was absolutely for magical matters. And when you get into it historically, that's pretty much de facto again around the world, where like we were looking to the moon because the moon would tell us like if things were going to come into being or not. And so utilizing lunar phases and lunar timing, and if you want to get like really granular with it, there's so many other details about the moon that you can throw in there, such as, you know, whether it's close or far away from the Earth, the fact that the nodes, what the nodes kind of represent, the lunar nodes, is if it's ascending or descending across the ecliptic. And like you can choose if it's rising, that's going to get more attention, and if it's descending, it's going to get less attention. You can combine all these elements and you can have a very robust, complete system of magic that is highly effective because the moon has such a profound effect on an esoteric level as to whether something comes into being or not. And we can observe this in the mundane world. It's one of the first practices that I recommend to anyone who wants to get like deeper into astrology is like keep a journal of the moon and see what's happening in your life as it crosses into various different houses in your chart when it's making aspects to different planets. You'll become an astrology pro in no time just following the moon.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more later about your own personal observations around that. But one thing I wanted to comment about that is it reminded me of I was actually taking like an Irish magic intro course recently, and as a part of that I was like on their Facebook group, and it wasn't an astrological group, like it was a magical group. And it's really interesting because like the teacher was talking about the moon and then was talking about other planets and stuff, and but people in the group were acknowledging how important the moon was for magic, but then they would be like, but astrology's bullshit. And it was just a really interesting tension, how like I know that can be a thing in magical communities where there's like this acknowledgement of the moon, but then there's a tension between like astrology and magic. And I know that there can be, at least I've heard that there's that in the astrological community as well with magic, but I feel like now we have this kind of astrological magic thing that many people are into. So it's like maybe a little different now than in the past, but yeah,
I think it's easier
funny.
for the astrology community because we're getting deeper and revealing more of the actual history. Like we're getting interdisciplinary people like Kristen Mathis, like we were talking about earlier, but also people like Eric Purdue and people who have like they have classics degrees and also they were like into witchy shit and like they have these multiple different areas of hyperfixation that now we get these incredible translations with more context than we've ever had. And because of that, the astrological community kind of has to concede the point.
Right.
Whereas like it used to actually be, and this is something that it's not talked about, but I know that it's like some discrimination that like Austin Coppock faced, and a lot of people would just be like, no, that's not real, or oh, that's silly. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but his book 36 Faces, like when it first came out, was kind of relentlessly made fun of for a while. And now it's sold out and everyone's like, can I get a copy? Can I get a copy?
Right.
Can I get
People
a
are
copy?
paying
Right?
like thousands of dollars on eBay to try and get a copy of 36 Faces.
Listen, I'm just so happy that I happened to buy a copy of that book before I knew what it actually meant. I was just like, that looks cool, and I like Austin's work. I'm just gonna get that. But yeah, it's one of those things where I find that the astrology community kind of has to concede because the more we learn about the actual religious, mythological implications and what they meant, the more that we suddenly understand astrology better and it makes more sense. And it's like, oh, well,
Right.
maybe this is an animate cosmos. Whereas I feel like what happens in the occult community, because I've straddled both for a long time now,
Yeah.
I think it's intimidation, to be quite frank. And I also know
Mm.
that most people who are into witchcraft, which is distinctly different than magic,
Yeah.
they're like, I make my own rules and I do my own thing. That's
Mm.
kind of the whole thing with why they're learning these systems, is they want to kind of supersede fate in a way. They want to be able to kind of move things to their will. And there's not
Mm.
as much consideration in some of those communities about how that impacts things outside of themselves. And so the idea of fate
Mm.
that is maybe not as supersedable is A, a little scary,
Yeah.
and B, very intimidating on the wavelength of like it takes so long to learn an occult practice, and then you want to add astrology on top.
Hmm.
And astrology, as you know, is a lifelong study.
Right.
But I do see a lot more people in the occult community knowing more about astrology than before, and I really credit people like Chris Brennan and his podcast, and
Hmm.
Sam Reynolds and his eminently approachable way of talking about astrology
Hmm.
for making it happen. Or gosh, our patron saint Demetra George
Mm.
for making some of the best books and lectures out there that are both like we're getting depth, but it doesn't feel hard to understand.
Right. It's very
Right.
accessible in a way. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I just want to say, yeah, I think it's like the magical, or like the impulse within maybe the magical or occult thing is like feeling disempowered and wanting to gain power. And as somebody that's known disempowerment, I have a lot of empathy for that. And I can understand why the real, it's like you can't have astrology in some sense without at least some kind of determinism. Maybe that's arguable, but there's this idea of like, okay, the sky in the moment that I was born has some effect on, to an extreme, people could say an extreme degree, or to just some degree, on how my life will unfold. It's like, yeah, that can be a hard pill to swallow if what you really want is a sense of agency and power.
That is absolutely what most people's motivation is for learning about witchcraft or magic, is to be able to kind of manipulate things to what you would like. That is finding a sense of power. I also think that a lot of people will mistaken that feeling when they really want connection.
Mm.
And so they're looking for something to be in relationship with, and maybe they don't jive with, Mother Mary.
Mm.
Maybe that's a little too easy and vanilla for them to swallow. Maybe they didn't have a figure like that in their life. Maybe they don't aspire to that. Maybe they really do connect with something that's a little bit more spicy, that has fangs. And I think that that's something, if more people would sit and think about this very
Hmm.
moon in the ninth house here, if more people would sit and think about what do I, what is spirituality? That's a great question. It's one that I ponder all the time. What's the
Mm.
point of it?
Yeah.
And what do I need for my spirituality? And I would guess that most people, when they get past the feelings of disempowerment, they actually will realize it's connection. They want
Mm.
connection. They want to feel connected in a world that feels eminently disconnected. And part of the disconnection is that feeling disempowerment, because a lot of what we're trying to do on our own, really we should be doing in a communal sense. We're not supposed to be doing it by ourselves.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, like, we don't have to get super into this, but I really relate, as someone that was like in my college years, very religious in, like, and a kind of like a mainstream religion. And like, just because of the institutional nature of that religion and the issues that came up around it, like, I can't do that anymore. Like, I can't go back there. And so I feel like I have been searching for a long time for that sense of ritual that I got. The feeling that came with that, something that's been repeated over time for thousands of years, as well as the community and the connection. So I really appreciate you mentioning that, because I do think that that is spot on. And that's, I think, what so many people are looking for.
I think a lot of people are in the same shoes as you, so I appreciate you saying that. There's mourning in that. And we
Yeah.
also don't sit with our mourning very well. And so it kind of reminds me of speed dating in a sense, where it's like they miss what they used to have, and so they just jump into something. And I think that there's also a polarizing effect where, like, if you were previously in this super purity culture, punishing kind of thing, you go and swing to the other side. I know I did that when I finally got through my atheist phase, where I was like, definitely not going back to that ever. But also, like, I'm too not like that. And I should go to something that's like really spicy and kind of dangerous and edgy. And I want to feel like, if there is a God out there, I want to feel like I have someone who's my ally, who's going to like kind of step in or help me feel like powerful in that case. And again, bad motivations, but this is what happens when we lack connection, is that we kind of flail around wildly, and asking those questions of like, what is it, or what is the purpose, or why does it exist? What do I want out of it? I think is so necessary right now, because we are faced with a smorgasbord of options, more than we've ever had. We've got access to everything, where previously you'd be lucky if you could find something at like Barnes and Noble, let alone like the internet didn't exist, So it's an inundation. I also think there's that kind of image versus actual relationship, and kind of being honest with yourself. Like, am I attracted to the image of something because I see these other people who are doing this, and I think they're kind of cool or sexy or whatever, and I want to keep up with them, I want to be like them? Or is it the development of your own soul?
Yeah. And it's okay if you just think someone's cool and you want to be like them. I feel like that's legit too. Like, that can lead to something perhaps deeper. And I do think it speaks to what you're talking about with like the desire for something spicy, quote unquote. And it's like, I think a lot of what we, I'm speaking in the abstract, like what we're given, the choices are like very aesthetic, and very ascetic, excuse me, and like very, very much kind of they're not an affirmation of like our whole personhood. And I think that, like it's really important for me to have like a spiritual practice that really like acknowledge and affirmed that like I'm a person that has desires, and that those desire can be good. It's like, it's not just something to deny. And so I think that that's like the holistic kind of desire of acceptance is, for lack of a better term, I think is something that is an attractive thing about these kind of alternative spiritual paths.
I totally agree. 100%.
Yeah. Wonderful. So yeah, let's talk about the sign of Cancer and what it means for you. And I would love to hear what myth you've prepared for us today in relation to the moon and the sign of Cancer.
So classically, like, the moon in Cancer, or Cancer in general, is the crab to the Greeks, right? Which gets kind of like a weird bit role. Basically, when Hercules is fighting against Hydra, the crab comes out and tries to protect its friend, tries to help its friend, and so it nips at Hercules' heels, and Hercules crushes it. And then Hera's like, I'm really impressed with you trying to help my, agenda here against Hercules. Here, you can go in the sky. And that's essentially the whole thing about the crab, which is absolutely wild, because to the Egyptians, this was way more important. The crab motif does go back in time. You do see that. And actually, it kind of sways between like a turtle and a crab. So same kind of idea of like aquatic creatures that can also go back on land, though. And that was really interesting. But the Egyptians believed that Cancer and Capricorn, if you ever look at them in the sky, even today, they're very dim. And this is really, really notable, especially because they are very close to along the ecliptic, which is the pathway of the sun. And to the Egyptians, the sun was the sun god. And so he would die and then be reborn again every single day. And his pathway was the supreme pathway. It's like the red carpet in a sense, right? And so those constellations along that pathway tended to be quite important, because they also would rise and set, et cetera, et cetera. Cancer and Capricorn, even all the way back then, were pretty dim. They were not very bright. And you can imagine, when we did not have light pollution, the implications of this, particularly when we're making interpretations based off the appearance of things and their various qualities, they started to see, because these guys were rising, Cancer and Capricorn, during the solstices, Cancer during summer solstice, Capricorn during winter solstice. They saw them as gateways. And Cancer was the gateway of life. And Capricorn was the gateway of the gods, or the gateway of the dead, basically. It was this idea that those who had died, their souls would go through the gateway of the dead, and those who were coming back into the world, or the new souls, would be born through the gateway of life. And the major star, the brightest star there, is Acubens. And Acubens was considered to be the sacred scarab beetle, which was the guardian at the gateways of life. And it was also the scarab beetle that would come and get into the sun god's chair after he had died and wait for his resurrection, right? So you see the scarab beetle used as iconography everywhere in various parts of Egypt, right? We see the scarab kind of in all the places. But then I wanted to go beyond this because, you can kind of look all this up. I wanted to go into a little bit more of an esoteric thing. Most people don't know this about me, but my own practice for however long it's existed has really segued into and been folk magic practice that I've had now for nearly 10 years. And so I love looking at folklore and folk tales and things like that. And what's interesting about it, what I love the most about folk tales, is that they're indigenous knowledge. It's just the same with, like, when we're looking at indigenous myth, from people who are still indigenous to this day, they're imparting knowledge about the land or about the place that they're from. That's really important. Seasonality, when to plant, when to harvest. I know that one of the big motifs for the Kayach in Scotland particularly is that you would give her part of your hunt, because that would bless you for the rest of the winter, to make sure that you never went hungry. You would also fill her flint box, because she had a lot to do with the fire, right? And if you had fire in your hearth or not. So if you didn't fill her flint box, then she would make sure that you were going to basically starve and be cold for all of winter, right? And so we've got these ideas from folklore that I think are really, really important. And the one that really stood out to me is actually my favorite folklore from when I was a kid. Little background here. My parents were hyper religious, and all of my Disney movies were edited, and some were just like straight up not allowed. Not allowed at all. And one of them was Sleeping Beauty. But guess what? I had a babysitter who did not know that, and she brought that movie to my house, and I was thrilled. It was the first time I had ever seen a witch in a movie. Also, I was not that into Aurora. I was super into Maleficent, because Maleficent was badass. I mean, she becomes a dragon, which, by the way, is part of the motif here of the moon. What do you know? But the original myth was not 3 fairies. The original myth is that there were 13.
Oh, interesting.
And 13 is the number of moon cycles we have in a year. The 13th was not invited to the coronation of the princess when she's a baby, the blessing of the princess, the seeing of the princess. And so this 13th, which actually represents the dark moon, lays a curse on the princess, that she will die by pricking her finger on a spindle. But she happened to be kind of like upset that she wasn't invited, and showed up and interrupted everybody, and she gave this curse, and then she was like, I'm out, takes her, little demon legion with her. And the 12th one had not given her blessing yet, her gift. And so she reverses it and says she will not die, she will sleep. So this is also astrological as well as lunar. But even the placing of this spindle, this spinning wheel, is a lunar motif that is seen everywhere, because the moon had a lot to do with this idea of spinning of fate, just like the Morai, just like the Graiae, just like the Norns. You find that almost every single lunar goddess, which there's quite a few in just Greece alone, they have a distaff or a spindle with them, because they are there to be the weavers of fate. And so when we see her prick her finger, this is both the spinning of fate, but also the pausing of fate. And it's talking about a cycle of time, because she sleeps for 100 years, which is considered to be completion of a cycle in European folklore. And this whole thing is lunar. The whole thing is lunar. Most people don't know this. This whole thing is just a giant lunar parable talking about the cycles of life, death, rebirth, as well as there's some stuff here around, harvest and planting and things like that. but it's one of my absolute favorites. Most people don't know the original tale. I would say it still holds with
Mm-hmm.
Three Fairies and Maleficent, because you
Mm-hmm.
have the three major, what we'd say like lunar, when we see the moon, right? And then you've got the dark moon, which is what the 13th fairy was supposed to represent, this idea of death or the final cycle. And the fact that she rises again is actually this kind of corollary with how the moon always comes back. The moon is going to come back after her cycle. Even
Right.
the age that she's at, 15, when she pricks her finger,
Mm-hmm.
has to do with halfway through the lunar cycle. So
Right.
everything is encoded with lunar symbolism from beginning to end of this folktale. And it's one of my favorites for very nostalgic Cancer moon reasons.
Wonderful. Amazing. I feel like I don't know if I've watched Sleeping Beauty actually. So I'm gonna have to get on my Disney Plus account this weekend or something and watch it because they have all the old Disney movies on there.
Let me
Um,
nerd out for a minute. You
yeah,
need to watch
please.
this because like Disney, this was his like final movie. Like it was his swan song. I love using
Hmm.
that term. And he wanted to make something that he could set to Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty suite. And so
Mm.
he actually completely altered his animation style and created incredibly new technology specifically for this movie. And it's highly underrated for how much effort he put in. It's absolutely gorgeous. Down to the
Mm.
fact, this is wild. They had already drawn Aurora, the main princess character, but the woman who played Aurora that they had bring in for a voice, because they're very particular about this. They didn't usually choose actresses that they could see. They would choose models and they would model their drawings of her. She just happened to look like Aurora. It was almost
Oh
like the whole
wow.
thing from beginning to end was faded in a way. But
Mm.
it's absolutely stunning. Obviously, Maleficent turning into a dragon represents eclipses.
Hmm. Absolutely.
So I highly recommend. I'm not a huge Disney movie fan. I'm definitely Team Studio Ghibli here, but this is
Mm.
one of the ones I make an exception for because there's layers to it and it's absolutely stunning.
Does Studio Ghibli have like a Sleeping Beauty alternative or
No, 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 no. What I meant
yeah?
was like I like the nuance of Studio Ghibli because one thing I
Mm.
find difficult about Disney movies, especially as I'm now an adult, is that kind of black and white storytelling where
Yeah.
like the hero is always the hero and the villain is always the villain. And there's kind of this inhuman quality to that way
Mm.
of telling myth. Whereas like Studio Ghibli is like nothing is that clear cut,
Mm.
right? Every hero is flawed. In fact, I
Mm.
don't know that we would really call them a hero in the Western sense. And every villain is incredibly human to where you can't just be like, and that's the bad guy.
Mm. Yeah, there is this really like interesting dream element to Studio Ghibli films. I've only seen a few of them, but I feel like there's like haunting beauty to them. And then I feel like for both of the ones that I've watched, which I think is one is Totoro and the other is Castle in the Sky, if I'm remembering the title correctly. By the end, I'm just kind of like, what did I watch? But not in a way where I'm like, what the fuck did I just watch? It's just kind of like, I'm just kind of like, whoa, like that sense of like quiet that comes with witnessing something beautiful, where you're just like, it's almost like a moment of wisdom, a moment of contemplation, where I'm like, I'm not quite sure what the lesson to take away is or what the message, and that's really interesting having been brought up on Disney movies and what you just said about the kind of black and white, like really digestible moral narratives or stories that like we're kind of fed in relation to this kind of more nuanced, abstract, open-ended, interpretive messages that we're getting from these other animated films.
I highly recommend for your Jupiter and Cancer, you need to watch Spirited Away. You need to
Okay.
do it.
I think we started watching it. That one might have been like I was like this might be a little too weird, but I'm not sure. I maybe we watched it all the way through. I'll have to see. That's the one where they like go he goes to like the it's like a I don't know, it's like a amusement park or something, but it's inhabited by like ghosts, right?
Yes. So it's Chihiro, the protagonist, will say. I don't know if we can call it, again, not sure about hero, the
Mm-hmm.
protagonist of the story. Uh, her family is hungry. They see this old kind of amusement park that used to be like a big thing, is kind of like going to the Spirit Bathhouse was an amusement park thing, but it's closed down. They're walking in And she's the only one who seems to detect that, which is interesting. Her parents are like
Yeah.
completely oblivious to it, and they start eating the food there.
Mm.
And that's actually, again, a very typical folkloric motif of like, you can't eat the food of the spirits or you will be kind of sucked into their world. She doesn't, but she gets stuck there because she's waiting for her parents. And
Who get
she ends
turned
up
into
having,
pigs, right?
they get turned into pigs. It's awesome. Um, and she ends up having to go and inhabit the parallel spirit world in this bathhouse.
Mm.
And it's a beautiful coming of age story because she is honestly the worst protagonist at the beginning. I cannot stand beginning of the movie Chihiro. I'm like, I want to
Mm.
smack this child. She is whiny and entitled and rude and everything. But by the end, she has really stepped into her own being. She's found her courage. She understands etiquette, not just etiquette on a human level, but etiquette on a spirit level, which I think is
Mm.
really fascinating. And more
Mm. Very
particularly, what you're
important.
seeing with the kind of weird stuff is Shinto. Everything that is kind of in Studio Ghibli that we don't fully understand is just cultural Shintoism that Hayao Miyazaki, who shout out my favorite Jupiter and Taurus person of all time, he's always incorporating all these elements of the natural world and the spirit world as if they are seamless. It's almost like magical realism in all of his films. And
Mm.
that's why there is no clear good or bad, because in Shintoism, a demon could be someone that helps you out.
Mm.
And a god or a spirit could actually be quite cruel to you. And there's this
Mm.
great nuance, and it's always connected back into the natural world. It's incredibly animistic. So those are my top ones. I'm a total,
Cool.
again, you can see my Cancer moon here. I'm like, I've watched them all 300 times. Um, but yeah, Sleeping Beauty has a very special part in my heart as far as a Disney film is concerned.
Wonderful. And yeah, so what does it mean for you to have your moon in Cancer? Can you tell us a little bit more about like the nuances of that and your experience of that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The first thing that always gets brought up is stereotypically like the crybaby moon. I just want a whole bunch of people to meet a bunch of Cancer moon people. That's not going to happen. We won't cry in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
That idea of kind of being the crab means that I'll go into my own little shell. I won't even cry in front of my partners most of the time. I'll go and find a
Mm.
place by myself. It's a very cathartic, ugly cry. I'm definitely not a pretty crier. It's like a ugly kind of cry thing. But that's because it has to be a complete thing, I believe. It has to be
Mm.
something where there's no inhibition. And I think that Cancer has this huge focus on safety.
Mm.
Safety as a feeling of comfort in a way. And that includes creating safety for other people,
Yeah.
being a safe space.
Mm.
It's funny because I think that's like the number one stereotypical thing, but you don't hear about everything else having that and food. And I will say, like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I I was supernaturally good at cooking basically instantly. I don't know how it works. I think it's because I just like good food, but it's
Mm.
not a huge focus in my life, which is interesting. In fact, if I don't have to feed other people, I literally could just eat, this is not a joke, oatmeal until I die. And
Mm-hmm.
oats are, food of the moon. So I guess there's that. But, I think there's a real quality here around wanting to care for others
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to create comfort and wanting there to be safety. I think safety
Mm-hmm.
is such a huge word here. That being said, there's also a thrilling kind of element here. And I think it's this idea of wanting to understand maybe the limits of our world as well as our body.
Mm.
Um, Now, the minute that it gets uncomfortable, we're going to be like, peace. This did not feel good. I'm done. I think I call it moon privilege. It's a weird thing, but when you've got that domicile moon, the minute that something feels off my body is very loud about
Mm.
it, extremely loud about it. And that means that I tend to actually take care of things health-wise rather quickly,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like waiting for something really awful to happen. Um, Whereas I watch a lot of people, and it's kind of that's why I started making the lunar rhythms reading, as I was watching my partners and friends and stuff, and I'd watch them push themselves, and they'd had signs the whole time. I'd be like, you don't think that maybe that's too much?
Mm-hmm.
And they'd be like, no, it's not that. It's not because I ate that thing, or it's not because I didn't sleep, or it's not blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
And then sure enough, they'd be like, I think that maybe I need to sleep more. And start to kind of mystify me, like, how is so many people not tapped in that way?
Mm.
And then I started to really think about that on a personal level. I was like, you have moon privilege, Amaya. Like, that's just that's never even occurred to you that someone wouldn't do that. Now I will push myself knowing I'm pushing myself. I'll
Yeah.
push myself and be like, especially if there's like a need to show up for others.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'll definitely push myself, usually beyond my own limits. If there's like a major responsibility thing, which I think is Saturn opposite my moon, I will completely and totally ignore my own needs in order to fulfill
Mm.
some sort of responsibility, particularly if it affects more than myself. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's really the crux there. Is there's this kind of reflective quality with Cancer.
Mm.
And there's a sensitivity with this moon to what's going on around you with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, it can be like a mommy. It's kind of a mom moon where you
Mm-hmm.
feel responsible for those around you. And mostly because you want to generate life. And I do think this is where we do see that kind of connection with like Acubens and the Cancer kind of constellation, is this idea of wanting to generate life.
Mm.
And with it being in my ninth house, how it's shown up in my early life is the people who saved me from my own demise were typically teachers.
Mm.
They were the most healing and wonderful people that I ever came into contact with. Art and literature teachers, particularly. It also gives me this kind of weird thing that I've been trying to shake, where I want to be like John Keating from Dead Poets Society when I teach people.
Uh-huh.
I want you to eminently believe in yourself, and that's such a supernatural character, and it's a lot of pressure to put on oneself
Mm.
to
Yeah.
show up and be like, no, the world is beautiful and you are too, and I want you to be a part of it. But
Mm.
that's because that's what I needed when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And um, I feel like there's a real thing about paying that forward.
Mm.
There is definitely a kind of, I always say this to my clients for so many different reasons, but I'm like, the body is the tuning fork here.
Mm.
The body is the place of much more information than you're going to glean in an intellectual way. It will seg into intellectual curiosity. You do see that a lot with the moon. Like the same base word of memory and mind comes from moon. There's a
Mm-hmm.
cyclical idea of time and cycles and sinking into it. And there is a sensitivity, but it's not one that's going to make itself known.
Mm.
A crab is squishy, but you don't know that until you break it open. My favorite meme is where there's that crab and someone hands it a butter knife
Mm-hmm.
and then it's swinging it around. That's the kind of joke I have about Cancer in general, especially with like the moon or Mars there, is like, you probably aren't going to fight your own fights, but you sure as hell are not going to hurt my people.
Mm.
I will
Yeah.
pick up your knife and I will be the defender of you. But as for me, this is where I do think I'm a big baby. Like if
Mm.
I'm in trouble or if something's wrong with me, I will kind of fall apart because there's a weird thing. I'm totally on board and ready to tap into like my courage and bravery for the people around me. But for
Mm.
myself, this is where I just kind of crumple and I'm like, I can't do it. That
Mm.
person's so mean and I don't even know what to say to them, kind of thing,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Um, but man, you better not say something mean to my family. I
Mm.
I will. Nah, that's not a good place.
Yeah, it's so interesting how the ninth house significations are come in so strongly for you, where, you talked about the importance of teachers, and that can be associated with the ninth house and your own sense of like how you want to be a teacher. But also talking about like, if we think about the ninth house as the joy of the sun and the associations with worldview and thinking in the way that the sun can be associated with thinking. It's very interesting to hear you talk about like knowledge and information and the development of wisdom through the body and what comes through the body rather than kind of like, what comes through the moon rather than what comes through the sun.
It wasn't always like that.
Mm.
And I love that you just saw that. And I'm also like, oh no, Scorpio rising in me is like, retract.
Mm.
But when I was
I'm
younger,
sorry, we can pretend I don't see you.
I can pretend. I'll just go behind my little Scorpio mask. When I was younger, I think I got told I was sensitive a lot because I was. I was
Mm,
sensitive, and I mean like sensitive not just in an emotional way, but like I could sense the room temperature, like what was going on with people. It would
mhm,
make me very like I'm still like this. I can get tense or suddenly try to like change things if I'm around people that feel a certain way.
mm,
I notice things a lot of people will completely miss. I'm very in tune with the environment.
yeah.
And what I mean by that is like where I work has to be a specific way, where I sleep. I literally cannot work and sleep in the same place, right?
Mm,
And I'm sensitive to food. Like I have such a midnight chart that I am literally allergic to the sun. I break into hives that
mm,
are horrible from being exposed to the sun. So like I'm a very lunar person, probably overly lunar because my moon's also like out of bounds and stuff. And because of that, I got more validation from being book smart because I loved
mhm.
reading books and sinking into fantasy, which is also actually a pretty lunar thing to want to like go into a fantasy world or sink somewhere
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
And I loved science because my that one of the few like happy things I have with my mom was like going outside and being in nature. And so
yeah.
I was just like a kind of nerdy, artistic kid who loved
Mhm,
being outside all the time. And I would get a lot of recognition for being smart.
mm,
And I didn't get that much recognition for being like in a positive way for being sensitive. I got a lot of like, Amaya, you're being too sensitive again.
mhm,
And so I leaned really hard on that and kind of went through a period. And I've talked to other Cancer moons who go through this where like they were told they were too sensitive for a lot of their childhood, which is like that's our superpower is actually that acuity. So it's such a
mm,
sad thing to shut it down, but we do. We will typically shut it down for a
mm,
period of time in our early adulthood because we've been so ingrained with this idea of like if we show any kind of emotion or if we talk about discomfort or anything like that, that somehow it's bad or we're not worthy or whatever. And I just kind of ruled my world by intellect alone.
mhm,
And what I started to realize as I got older is knowledge is kind of useless if there's no experience.
mm.
Like you can sit there and read a book all day, but have you actually gone out and seen what happens to the tides when the moon is doing certain things with the sun?
Mm,
Because that's not the same thing. And you won't
mhm,
remember it nearly as well if you don't have that lived in body experience, which is why this kind of idea of separation of like, no, the moon is the body and Mercury is the mind. First of all, our idea of both of them come from Thoth, and
mm,
Thoth was a moon god.
yeah.
So um, and it's interesting, we separate them out. And I do think it's good to have separate functions here in a lot of ways, but we forget that the mind was originally the gut.
Mm,
Our first brain was the gut. So that idea
mm,
of gut feelings, which is highly attached to like Cancer and Scorpio and these kind of watery placements that the moon takes a lot of comfort in,
mhm,
is the first place that we get information from, and we don't understand it anymore because we have separated ourselves from our animal selves. We've
mm,
decided to completely forget that we are animals. It's interesting how when you get into things like occultism and magic and stuff, even art, you need to respect that. That's actually how you're going to be able to find whatever power it is that you're seeking, but also genuine connection is something that you feel in the body before you hear it in your brain.
mhm,
And so this became a real kind of like obsession of mine.
mm,
Just before my Saturn return, I was trying to get back into a creative practice. I hadn't created anything in like 11 years. And I realized like I could read. I love reading. I probably have more books on art than anyone needs to know. I
mhm,
could read all day about how to draw, but until I actually did it, it did
mm,
not matter.
mm, yeah.
So there's a real thing here for me about like the tactile quality of experience as teacher, of
Mm,
the body being the tuning fork and the alembic in which we actually go beyond just a shallow understanding of something to a deeply embodied experience where now it can kind of go into that alembic and eventually, if we're lucky, become wisdom.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I was just being reminded of the fact that I grew up in New York City in this beach community. And so I literally could hear the waves breaking on the shore from my childhood window, and that's like, I think I say that because that is a really important part of how I relate to water and sound. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the difference that we can have with other people, like you spoke to, reading about the tides, but it's like, what does the sound of the crashing waves mean to you? And that's, maybe you grew up by a river, and so your sound of water is different, and that means your relationship with water is going to be different. And I feel like I'm trying to speak to something important about like my own spirituality, but I think it's just important to for us all to kind of acknowledge our different experiences of these things and how that can inform our viewpoint, but also inform the way that we can move forward.
Absolutely. Right before we got on our call, I was thinking about that mind-body separation, right? And it's interesting because the mind develops because of the body. So how you grew up and your experiences will change the way your mind works. And we know this because, I mean, not to go too dark here, but childhood trauma will really fuck a body up, but it also really changes your mind. Makes your nervous system really turned on to an extent that it's almost impossible to turn it off. And that's experience. It's not something that, again, we come back to that idea of like, I can't intellectualize it. You had to experience something pretty terrible, and then it changes the way that you're able to focus, communicate, deal with conflict, deal with happiness. I don't think we talk about that a lot. And so this idea of like our experiences, we will often throw them out the window for some sort of like, how do I put it nicely? It's a word that came up in a friend's story of mine, but I'm going to use it in a way that I think makes more sense. It's like we're monocropping intelligence. Like there's only one. And I think that it's really important. This is why getting in touch with your own natal moon is so vital. How you intuit things and puzzle them out and experience them is not just vital to you. Our world needs this fractalization. And when we dismiss that and we try to become one uniform idea of what is intelligent, what is sentient, what is this, what is that, we are actually moving against the very basis of creation itself. And that is the variety and the beauty in the variety. You grew up next to the ocean. You know what the sound of that ocean, particular for that area, sounds like, and probably the various different seasons. I didn't grow up next to the ocean. I wish I had, because I really almost went into marine science when I was younger. But I did grow up next to a lot of like lakes and rivers and creeks, and I have a real fondness for the sound of something babbling, trinkling over rocks, to the extent that like my little, not podcast, I don't know what I'm calling it bog walk talks. I'm just making them randomly for my mailing list. At the end, where we sit back at the same place where it makes the sound that reminds me of my childhood, because it's so soothing to me. And maybe it's meaningless to everybody else, but I feel like I gain some wisdom every time I sit next to that body.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask quickly, if like for the Cancer moons out there who are listening, who are resonating with that feeling of like, oh yeah, I was told I was really sensitive when I was a kid too, and I'm finding it hard to touch back into that now that I'm in adulthood or what have you. Like if you have any suggestions for those people for like tangible things they can do to kind of get back in touch with that.
Well, I mean, the first thing I recommend is vagus nerve therapy. I think that's a big thing, is that part of the reason, I know for myself, I can't speak for anybody else, that I was told I was sensitive is because I had a lot going on in my childhood. Don't want to go into all that, but there was a lot of trauma and stuff. And it became a raw nerve. And I think that if you had parents or caregivers who were dismissive of how you felt, it's very important that you reparent yourself. And for me, the best way that I found that was with vagus nerve work. So that would be the first thing, is like, if you can get yourself, there's a lot of like online, it's a kind of somatic therapy that particularly helps you retune the vagus nerve or the vagus nerve, which is very important, I find. Because what happens is we can be overly sensitive because we're so wide open. There is this kind of thing about the moon being this receptive vessel of light, but that also means that you're receptive to the things around you. And that can be environmental, it can be food, it can be people, it can be just about anything, to the degree that like I don't watch certain types of media or listen to certain types of music because it does have a jarring effect on my nervous system. And so doing something like vagus nerve work is really, I think, very powerful. If you can't do that, breath work, I think, is very accessible for everybody. For me, it has come down to understanding that vulnerability is not a weakness. And I did that by kind of traveling at the speed of trust, which is to say, like, first of all, don't do this with everybody. That is like, that's the super highway to hell for cancers, okay? There are going to be people who don't respect it, who don't deserve that kind of vulnerability from you. But if you've got a partner or a friend who you feel super safe and comfortable with, first of all, they probably already sense, in a way, the kind of tides that you have. Like, I don't talk a lot about what I'm feeling when I'm upset at this point, but I had to go through a period where I had to almost over-explain myself to my partners, because I could wall up so well that when I finally like would burst like a volcano, which so many people have this problem, they'd just be like, what is happening? What is happening right now?
Why didn't you tell me 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, cancers, we're kind of renowned for our memory, so it kind of builds. And so what I would say is start with someone who you already have that feeling of trust with. And you can start with something really simple. You don't have to start with something big. I think that's really important, but you need to start creating new experiences. Because again, the body is the tuning fork here. And so you're going to have to go through a number of positive experiences where you are vulnerable with someone that is worthy of that level of trust and intimacy. And it starts to kind of retune you. And if you have a negative experience, coming back to remembering we're very empathetic, that's one of our key traits. That person may not have been in a place of capacity for you where they could actually hold that space for you. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. And also doesn't mean that they're purposefully trying to hurt you. And that's something I always kind of come back to. It might even be valuable to ask at the beginning, like, do you have the space and capacity to talk about something that I'm a little sensitive about? And I also think it's good to name what you want, because every chart's different. I'm not just a moon in Cancer. I'm also an Aquarius Sun, Aquarius Mercury, and I've probably thought of all the solutions, and I do not want help with solutions. That is not what I want.
Yes.
What I want is just to whine. I want to vent. I want to put my emotions out there. I want someone to tell me it's okay. I want someone to hold that space. I'm a very verbal processor when I'm in a healthy space. And so I don't really want someone to help me solve something. You may be different though. And I think it's important to think about, what do I want or need right now? Because if you go into it and you don't make that statement and you haven't asked if someone has capacity and all that fun stuff, what's going to happen is when you don't get the reaction or response that you want, you're going to take that as a sign that this is not worth doing. And that's not how it actually goes. People can't read your mind. They don't know what you can read a situation. Cancer moons can read a situation, and I know if people want a solution or if they just want me to pat their back and tell them it's going to be okay, right? But not everybody's like that. Most people aren't. And especially if you're really good at masking those emotions, you're really good at putting up that wall, this may be something that they're totally unprepared for. And so you need to help a little bit. And that, I think it's important to say, that doesn't cheapen what's happening between the two of you. Right? But that would be my advice. Move at the speed of trust. I also recommend the vagus nerve work or some breath work. It will help tremendously. I know that Diana Rose Harper, our favorite person, did a workshop with Mars and breathwork, and I think at some point she'll probably put out the recording. So, and it's eminently more affordable than going and talking to a breathwork therapist if you cannot afford it. So those would be my 2 top recommendations. Maybe the third one be doing something creative.
Cool. Yeah, I will say that Nathaniel Hottership, Diana's, and my friend, runs an organization called Breathwork for Recovery, and Diana collaborated with Nathaniel. I actually go basically every week to his breathwork group, and so I'll link that in the show notes as well. It's been a really great resource for me. The other thing I want to do is just give a shout out to this podcast called Multi-Amory. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a podcast about polyamory, and they had an episode on this thing called Radar, which is like almost like a relationship business meeting. It's not as boring as I'm making it sound. It's actually really cool practice, but they talk about this thing called the Triforce of communication. Sometimes I feel like in polyamory circles, there can be the weirdest vocabulary that people have, like compersion. I'm just like, what are these words? But anyway, it's just the idea of what you're talking about, which I've kind of had to institute in my own relationships, because like you, I absolutely basically never want advice unless I ask for it. I like want to be heard. That's mostly what I want. I want someone to like hear what I have to say. And so it's basically just like, do you want advice? Do you want to be heard? Or I always forget the third one, but there's like, and just being very explicit, like, this is what I want from what I'm saying. And because it's likely that your partner has a default for the way that they respond. And that might not be the way that you want to receive, but that does not mean that like your relationship is doomed or that person is the wrong person for you or anything like that. It could literally just mean being explicit in communication about like, I know that you have a tendency to give advice. I don't want advice. Thank you. I just want to say this thing to you, and I want you to hear it and offer me some empathy or what have you. So I just want to suggest that resource for people as well, because it's been really helpful for me. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to talking a little bit about the relationship of your moon and your sun, and how lunar phase plays into your experience of your moon.
Oh, well, my moon and sun are almost opposite each other. It's actually within orb. I do count it. I have a nice T-square between my sun, my moon, and my Mars.
Mm.
And that's why it's always been a battle between like, I can be really heady. I have an air sun. And literally, because of the weird way I was born, I was like a 24, 25-hour dry birth. I got stuck in the birth canal. My mom wanted me to be born on George Bush Sr.'s second inauguration. And it didn't happen because I have Mars and Taurus. And I was like, not today, Satan.
I'm not doing that. No.
And yeah, I have what I call the T-square of don't tell me what to do. So, you know, it's funny because that's where you see like the sun is very kind of heady and can even be very friendly when I feel up to it. I think that's the key. It is down in the fourth house, so I have to feel up to it. Whereas like I have this very wet, out of bounds, nearly full moon. It does like friends, but it's also socially anxious. And most of the time I will be the one who kind of lurks in the corner and is watching everybody. I'm like, we're all having a good time. I didn't say hello to anyone, but I'm having a good time. And I think because I had training from an early age, my sun rules my midheaven in performance, it makes it look like I'm much more social and outgoing than I am. But anyone who meets me in person will testify to how I will cling to you like a little crab if we're in a group of people that I don't know, and I will just be like, you are my only friend and I only want to talk to you because I don't know these people. So there's kind of like this thing where I have to flip on the charm for things like podcasts and what have you. It is an interesting duality to have this like kind of super heady, almost overly logical, very Saturnian side of myself, and then like I love watching Studio Ghibli films on repeat, give me my comfort foods and my blankie moon, right? Also kind of like my son wants to really logic and like see all the receipts for everything, and my moon is like, we don't need that. You just know. Which, because I was kind of super invalidated about that for most of my upbringing, I've had to really learn how to not invalidate myself when it comes to that. Like, you have a gut feeling, just go with it. You don't have to explain yourself. No one needs to know. You don't even need to know. Just follow it, right?
Right.
Because truly in my chart, my moon is the gift. So, as far as moon phase is concerned, I mean, I have a waxing gibbous moon. It's super waxing, like a few more degrees and we have it's totally full. And because of that, I do feel this thing. Sam Reynolds kind of teases me about it all the time. It's no matter how much I've prepared, I never feel prepared moon. Because it's constantly almost full.
Right.
And there's just kind of striving here. And one of the things I do like about it is the striving to constantly master or self-improve, because I never feel like I am the master of anything, which I think can be a burden sometimes, because I can be very good at things and completely oblivious to the fact that I'm good at things. I have to have other people tell me that it's good, which is a very typical thing. I think that's where the sun and the moon aren't quite in that aspect. They don't quite see each other, because I will not be cognizant of it until someone's like, that's really good. And I'll be like,
Yeah.
what?
Really?
All I see is everything I need to change about this. I also think that that nervous quality can lead me to some interesting breakthroughs, because like I was sitting here doing research all week long of like, I bet everyone's done every lunar myth ever told by the Greeks. Like, what am I going to talk about? Like, because I don't want to be like a repetitious person, right? And like that can be really a nice push. It is out of bounds, so it can be over the top about that. And something that, like, when I finally opened my books, I was so nervous. And I was like, Sam, no one's going to book with me and I'm not ready. And he was like, in 10 years, you will not be ready. Go do it, right?
Yeah.
And so there can be a real thing here about where I'm constantly trying to prepare and not doing the thing. And that's why I'm so like invested in, how do I do the thing? How do I get embodied? How do I have the experience instead of just constantly being in preparation mode? Like, this is not an SAT, this is life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I have an out of bounds moon as well. And maybe for the listeners, if you could just give a, just quick explanation of like what it means for the moon or a planet to be out of bounds, and a little bit more about how you experience that in your own life.
So an out of bounds moon is when, well, any planet out of bounds is when they have traveled really far away from the ecliptic, farther than they do on average, because no planet is just sitting there rotating in a perfectly straight line across the pathway of the sun, right? So they're all kind of wobbling up and down, and the moon is the one that actually wobbles the highest and the lowest up and down the ecliptic. And so when you've got an out of bounds moon, it will change or exaggerate, or sometimes the opposite, it'll completely dampen it down in a way that you don't expect. Like, I've got a friend who's got an out of bounds moon that is in the opposite direction from my out of bounds moon, and it's almost like so reserved that it's negligibly noticeable as far as like what part of their personality kind of sticks out, and it's like super prominent in their chart. You have to get to know them on a very personal, that kind of need for intimacy Cancer has comes really, really strong with this one, where you have to get to know them really well to understand what's going on. Whereas like for me, I learned the art of masking, but when I was a child, would I be capable of that? Absolutely not. If I was upset, I was really upset. I mean, I was kind of like known for like when I finally got upset, because it took a long time, I would have epic meltdowns. I did not have tantrums like other kids where they get over it in an hour or two. I could have a tantrum for like 12 hours straight. Wow. Complete emotional dysregulation. It doesn't go that way now. I find that that's more of my Mars, as my Mars is in Taurus, and like it takes so long for it to get mad. Then when it does, it's like the Hulk. But it's like the Hulk for like an hour or two and then it's done, right? But my moon now, it's more like that sensitivity is like dialed up to 300. So an example was recently, I went to Galway for the first time. Despite living here for a while now, I haven't like gone and visited much of Ireland. And so I finally went to Galway with my partner, and I thought I was going to love it because I had seen and read all this stuff. The minute I got off the bus, it felt like all the life got sucked out of me. Like my energy was gone. It was really crowded. It felt extremely commercial. It didn't feel particularly Irish, especially compared to the very rural parts of Ireland that I live in that are actually, I realize now, like, oh, we are very Irish here. And I did not enjoy it, but also I think it's because I felt like everyone around me was almost like a black hole trying to like consume. And that was dialed up to like 1,000. So like we went out to eat. I barely remember what I ate. It took us finding a body of water, this beautiful river, the River Corrib, for me to be like, okay, I can breathe. Okay. And it also made me want to just crawl up into my shell so hard that like most of the time I'm a very polite person. I will constantly be like, excuse me or pardon me, things like that. I was just like getting rammed into by people because it was very crowded that day. And like I said nothing. Like I was just like so inward. And I'm also a very observant person usually. And I was like, nope, beeline to I didn't even know where we were going. I was just like, let's go this way. And I found water. And I was like, oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Some sort of calmness in all of this. This is too much. So I feel like my nervous system is probably amped up to a degree that is beyond just, I already have trauma stuff, and then it goes beyond that because it's been like that since I was a kid. It made me very, very spiritually sensitive from like the age of 2 onward. And that was a really scary sensation when I was a child. Not so much now. I finally got some training and help. I think I was the incorrect people around me for that time period to help me with what was going on. Now I have a lot of training and help for that as well, so that I know how to deal with like energetic boundaries, particularly, and emotional boundaries, because that can be really difficult when you've got a much more exaggerated Cancer moon, I think.
Yeah. And I will just say for myself, I mean, I have a Sag moon in the first that's out of bounds, pretty closely conjunct Mars. So there's a lot going on. But I also like relate to the spiritual sensitivity. And I think that there's probably something with like Moon ruling the 8th and the 1st and Jupiter in the 8th. I'm sorry, Moon in the 1st ruling the 8th and vice versa with Jupiter. Are there other aspects in your chart with your moon that you think are important to discuss?
I think the most notable thing about my moon is that it sees almost every single planet in my chart except for Mercury.
Oh, wow.
So it sees my ascendant. It's opposite Capricorn stellium in my 3rd house. It sees my sun. It makes aspects to all the stuff I have in Taurus, which is basically my whole chart there. And it also even sees my nodes. So I mean, the only thing it doesn't see is it doesn't see my Mercury, my IC, and my MC, and that's it. So the moon really is kind of like, this is gonna be crude, but she's that bitch in my chart. You know, and it took me a long time to embrace it. I put so much attention on Saturn because Saturn is the dispositor of everything else in my chart, and so I put so much emphasis on that. But the moon really is just like doing the most in my chart as far as being a translator of light. It really is translating all of the light.
Amazing. Okay, yeah, and I would love to hear your thoughts, if you care to share, about the moon's lot and how perfections play into that as well. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the lot of fortune?
Ooh, it's one that I've been giving more attention to recently. My friend Jake Green did a lot of work with the lots. And I was really fortunate to do a couple of like workshops with him on another lot called the Lot of Cultivation, and one for like the Lot of Spirit conjoined fixed stars. But the Lot of Fortune, I think, is one that we kind of overlook because partially maybe because it's something that's not totally within our control. It is kind of like, this is truly the lot that you are given in life. And this idea, I was just reading up about how like the idea of the Morai, right? So the Morai were actually another one of those kind of figures that get attached to the moon. And the Morai were these 3, we call them the Fates now. These 3 figures that were spinning a thread, and this was the thread of life, right? And you could say that Lachesis, who is the central one, she actually is doing the weaving or the spinning of it. She has a lot to do with this idea of like the lot that you are given, right? So this could be family, it could be wealth or lack thereof, resourcing, it could be what part of the world that you're in, et cetera, et cetera. And so where your lot of fortune is placed in your chart and the ruler of your lot of fortune, as well as if it makes an aspect to your moon, is absolutely vital, I think, to kind of understanding our place in the world. But also, for me, I do a lot of remediation in my work. Like I've been doing remediation now for 4 years. And how do we help you with shifting that a little bit to bring out more of the positive significations? And then for the stuff that you can't really control, for example, if you were born with some sort of physical disability or something like that, how do we learn how to make peace and make the most out of that? And looking to your lot of fortune and what's going on with the lot of fortune is, I think, super vital. Particularly that placement, like where is it in the chart? And is it making a harsh aspect to like the ascendant, to the midheaven? Because that will kind of change a lot. Like, what do we need to do to help? So for me, Venus is the ruler of my lot of fortune. Thankfully, my lot of fortune does make an aspect to my moon. And so I do a lot of Venus work, which I need to do anyways, because it's co-present with Saturn. And while Venus is okay in Capricorn, it's not like the best, you know? And so I do a lot of like work with Venus remediation regarding things like I have a creative practice, which also segs into like Venus and the moon being in a applying opposition. I had to start thinking more about like, as I've gotten older, I'm like, okay, how do I present myself? I didn't really care that much most of my life. And I'm like, unless I had a very particular reason, which is such a Venus and Cap thing to be like, ugh, people are going to see me this way. So I gotta change that. But like, how do I want to show up? What are my values? What is that going to look like in the world? And that started kind of changing things. You don't realize these little things, which seem so mundane, so silly, changes so much about the fortune or the things that you've been handed in life, whether that is the state of your health, how other people perceive you so that you can have better opportunities or whatever, how you take care of yourself and how you feel about yourself, et cetera, et cetera. And if we don't look to that lot, because the moon is the mediatrix, we could do a lot of things in life and then be like, why does it keep happening like this?
Right.
And learning how to do that is important. The second thing is like the perfections, right? So perfections, we can perfect from the lot of fortune. You can perfect from any lot, actually. So perfections is an interesting technique by which every single year of the life, a particular house becomes activated in the chart, and that lord of the house becomes your lord of the year, as well as the lords that are actually in the house at that time. When you actually perfect from the lot of fortune, it will tell you a lot about like, what are the circumstances of this year?
Right. Yeah.
What's going on with that, right?
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to Ali Alomi because he has like a whole series of lectures on timing techniques, but talks about in his perfections lecture in particular, he talks about like the four, like how you can perfect from everything, but like the medieval Islamic astrologers like would definitely do four, and it was the MC, the lot of fortune, the ascendant, and the sect light. And yeah, it's like the perfection from the lot of fortune would tell like what would befall you that year. So kind of what you're speaking to about like what's going on, like what's the, you know, what kind of things are happening around you, because you could have like a great ascendant perfection where the condition of the year is wonderful, but like maybe the lot of fortune, some challenging things are happening, or vice versa, and we can just get like some more information about how a particular year will unfold.
Yeah, especially what I like to look at is, are those lords working together? Or are they in a harsh aspect or in, you know, very different signs? Do they not see each other, right? So like you can take a look at that lot of fortune and what's going on with the perfections and go, okay, I'm going to align myself to these circumstances, right? And when we don't do that, we can have this great, like you said, perfection from the ascendant, or the sect light is one that I really look at a lot, is the sect light. And it's like, why isn't this going the way I want it to? And it's like your lot of fortune, it's perfected house. That lord doesn't play well with the other lords, and you might have needed some remedial measures here, or you might have needed to realign your expectations and your actions to fit with the circumstances that you're being given.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and do you take the, like there's some talk about taking the lot of fortune as like a secondary ascendant. Do you kind of do that at all? And do you like have this idea of like fortune houses?
You know, I haven't played with that concept as much as I should. And I think the reason why is because in my own chart, my lot of spirit and lot of fortune are in the same house.
Okay.
And like, so same with my, they're all there with my ruler of my ascendant. So like, it doesn't give me enough variety, I think. Also, I'm always side-eyeing my Mars and Taurus. So it's just like, I don't know, but I should play with that more. I think I just revealed one of my inherent biases where I'm like, not you.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay. We're allowed. We're allowed to have biases. Just to speak to my own bias, I'll say Rob Hand has this really great Norlac lecture, I think from Norlac like 2005, where he talks about taking a lot of spirit as the ascendant and how that's kind of like, I don't know how to describe it in a way that doesn't feel weird, but it's like if you were kind of like perfectly living out your fate or perfectly like making the choices that your lot of spirit wanted you to make towards the evolution of your soul, like this is what your life would look like. And I have the lot of spirit in my 12th house in Scorpio, which I have like not a lot of contact with. And so I'm just kind of like, I don't know about that. Like that feels a little hard for me. So I feel, it's like, I don't know if I'm going to be doing that or I'm not doing it right now, but it's like, yeah, I think that's the cool thing about the astrological community is like, not everybody has to do everything, it's like maybe somebody else does that work and that's more kind of fitting for them.
Absolutely. I actually think that our divination method is something that chooses us too, because the divine is speaking to us, right? And so like I do really well with like secondary progressions and profections and using particular like profections from different places and solar returns. I'm actually pretty good at solar returns, but like I can do zodiacal releasing, but I don't feel like it's my thing, Actually makes me a neurotic mess in my personal life, and that's why I stopped using it, because I was like, nope, I don't need more excuses for that waxing gibbous moon to think like it needs to prepare more. And I find people who do it, I honestly am just like, you guys are the goats. Like,
yeah,
it's so much work, first of all, and secondly, to become really good at interpreting that. I think takes a massive amount of skill and practice, and I'm very impressed by it, but like I just don't have it in me to do it. I just don't.
Yeah, I feel that. Do you have any suggestions for practitioners that do zodiacal releasing well, you think?
Oh my goodness. Who do I think does zodiacal releasing well? I mean, like obviously the GOAT is going to be Patrick Watson. That's the king. Trying to think about I think all my contemporaries are in the same boat as me, where we're like the ones that I'm really close to are like, yeah, that's not for me. I do know that my friend Whitney, trying to remember, I think she goes by Cobra and Crescent on Twitter and Instagram. Like she's been knocking it out of the park for herself with the ZR. I know she does a lot of just like talking about the connection to like Egyptian astrology, which by the way is amazing, and that's another thing you guys should check out. But as far as someone I've seen like applying it religiously, like holy cow, that's impressive. And I'd really be interested. I don't know if she's doing readings for other people in that vein, but I feel like she should. So like,
yeah,
here you go, Whitney. You need to do it.
I'll have to ask her if she is, because Whitney and I are kind of homies and interact on Twitter as well. Yeah, I want to just give a shout out real quick to Kira. She has a great lecture on zodiacal releasing, and I know that's kind of like Kira Ryberg. That's kind of like her focus. She like focuses almost not exclusively on ZR, but that's one of like her main focuses. So I want to give a shout out to her. And yeah, just curious if like, how secondary progressions come into this and like how you've seen maybe some modulation of that natal lunar phase with like the secondary progressed lunar phase.
Oh, so a great example of this is I moved into I think I'm in a full moon now. Because when you're born with a waxing gibbous, you're going to quickly go through into the dark side, right, in life. And so I'm now back in a full moon phase. And I'm actually at a point, this is the first year, and I think I progressed into it, I want to say like the end of last year, where I don't feel the need to prepare nearly as much as I used to, which is really saying something, because I mean, I used to be a neurotic mess before any podcast, before any class I did. Like I would try to shove as much into it as possible. And in fact, I started asking myself, I was going through my books. I'm trying to like become much more focused on like where I want to take my practice and my own private life and all that. Started asking myself like, why do you need this knowledge?
Mm,
And I've never asked myself that before. Like I think I'm just such a super nerd, and knowledge itself is almost like it's like a turn on or something. It's like candy.
mm,
And I started going through my books, and I'm like, I'm starting to feel stressed by the number of books I have in my library that either I don't read or have not read because I tell myself I should,
hmm
or that it would be good, or it would be a good reference.
Yeah.
And the full moon is kind of like it's fully arrived, and it's also more focused on like what is helpful to others. It's more relational
hmm
rather than just feeling like I'm preparing, I'm preparing, I'm preparing, I'm preparing.
Yeah.
And that's been a very new thing this year. And I feel like obviously it's the first time as an adult where I've felt that way.
Mm,
I couldn't speak to it because the last time that happened, I would have been like 3 or 4 years old, I think.
right. Mm,
Yeah, it very much there's an ease that I haven't had. And also there's this bigger focus. So with the waxing gibbous, it's been much more like again preparation and improving and things. But now I'm like, what is the value of what I'm giving to others?
mm,
Not just me trying to feel safe, which I think that's what that is when I'm trying to prepare is a need for
right.
safety. Um, but like, what is the value of what I'm giving to others? And I also feel like there's a feeling of stability around like, if someone doesn't feel that value, then they're not the person for me.
Mm,
And before, I will tell you, I've had a few instances of this where I'll do like a workshop, and this is how lunar people, I think, often will relate. Um, and I've gotten lots of praise for it, but one person will come at me with some actual good like it's critique that I can consider it as valid. Like it's one thing to be like, I just didn't like it, because then I'll be like, well, you don't
okay.
have to.
Yeah.
You want a refund? Like,
Mm,
but it's another when someone is like, well, I just feel like this is what you promised, but you didn't do this, this, and this, and I felt like you focused more on
mm,
this. And me to be like, actually, they're right. And then me
mm,
freaking out about it and being like, should I redo this whole thing?
mm,
Right? And I've had that happen a couple of times where it completely throws me for a loop and freaks me out. And it's not a pleasant place to be, but now I'm at the point where I'm like, well, then this probably isn't for you.
yeah.
This probably isn't for you because the people that did need this have also spoken up and said, gosh, I needed that.
Mm,
And thinking more about like, how is this going to serve somebody else? What can I give? There's a real giving quality here. Whereas before, I will admit that while I always want to be someone who's giving, I think that's a Cancer kind of thing to want to make sure
mm,
everyone's fed. My own safety, I think, took a greater precedence over that, where I'm like, do I feel safe enough, smart enough? Smart is safe, right?
mm,
Do I feel
mm,
smart enough, prepared enough
right.
to give this to the world where I will feel like I am above criticism or my main thing, and I think a lot of us feel this way, is like we call it the trad chad community,
Mhm,
right? It's people who are super purist about things, really, really old school. And like I think all of us have this great fear that we're going to receive the ire of the trad chads.
mm,
And for someone who used to put so much emphasis on my intellect as a value, or even my whole self-worth, like the last thing I want to do is to get into intellectual debate to the degree that our good friend Gabe Rosas will tell you there's many times I've come to him and been like, am I right about this? And like, can you verify this? Because I feel like Gabe is like literally the smartest person in our community.
mm,
And he's always like, Amaya, you know what you're doing.
mm.
You're fine. And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, so I feel like that's eased up a hell of a lot, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm like, damn, this is nice.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
But that's
Excited for
that's the
you.
qualitative difference. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
Have you had an experience like that with do you use progressions? I'm curious.
I mean, the kind of start of my astrological studies, which was like just last year, which is weird to say given the fact that I like have this podcast and stuff like that. But I had a progressed new moon eclipse.
Ooh.
Yeah. and it was in my third house in Aquarius, and I was in grad school at the time for urban planning, and like basically to the day that it went exact, I basically had like a complete personal collapse around being in grad school, and like was basically just like I had burnt out so hard in that year being in school, just like kind of like with work and school, working like 80, 90 hours a week for a whole year. And like the first semester was great. And then the second semester, like I just very quickly, I was just like, this is not actually really what I want to be doing. And this isn't resonant. I don't think I'm going to really actually fit into this kind of, because it's like, you know, training to be a kind of a bureaucrat, we're fitting into a system. A month, so I kind of like to the day had this like falling away from that. And then a month later, you know, I've been kind of studying astrology, and I for a while, but I went to Norwalk a month after that progressed new moon eclipse, and like that's really where I feel like a spark was lit for me with like a passion for learning astrology. So I kind of traded like being in grad school for for like learning astrology really intensely, and now I'm in the, you know, I'm about to move next month into the progressed crescent, where the, you know, like the sun and the moon will be 15 degrees away from each other, and like that first sliver of the progressed moon will start to be seen. And so I'm really excited to see what seeds that were planted at that progressed new moon eclipse start to sprout now that the moon will start to be visible. So I feel like it really is descriptive of like the phase of life that I'm in, at least in that particular instance. And it seems to show up like when I do readings for other people or talk to them about their charts. It seems to be really resonant. You know, if someone is like waxing towards a full moon, there's like some type of culmination that's occurring. Or if someone's in like a, you know, a balsamic phase, it's like real feelings of, you know, turning inward and reflecting, and maybe lower energy levels and what have you. So yeah, I love secondary progressions, especially the progressed lunar cycle.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, in my client sessions, it's like the fastest way to get a read real quick on what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I find that it's resonant, but it's also revealing, because what I find in session is that clients often feel like something is wrong with them. I can't explain how many times I have that conversation. And then I'll be like, well, you know, this is where your progressed moon is, and usually this is what it would mean. And they'll be like, oh, really? And I'm like, yeah, actually, you're right on time. This is the thing that's supposed to be happening. And they'll be like, oh, okay. And like the level of relief is really tangible, I feel, when people feel like they've sunk up with what I would say nature or divinity has kind of like planned for them. And it's a nice way to like quickly be like, let me just pull that up in AstroGold and look at our sheets, and oh, look at that.
Yeah, and I think that can be so comforting, because it's not like a transit that you might follow regularly, but it's also like this idea of like, if you're like, I'm born with a balsamic moon, so I kind of like am used to what that feels like. But I can imagine if by progression you're going through a balsamic phase, you're just like, what the fuck is going on? Why is it like this right now? And so I think if you can have someone be like, yeah, that's exactly like, that's what you're going through, that makes a lot of sense, given the fact that like the moon has, you know, is 10 degrees away from your like your progressed sun, or, you know, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very therapeutic tool in a way. And I also find that it's important for understanding, like sometimes you can have like this awesome perfection and you're like, yeah, it's gonna be great. And then you find out like that moon phase, because the moon is the mediatrix, it's what's going to actually cause things to generate or decay in the life. It's either gonna grow or it's gonna go away. And so if you've got this great perfection, but that lunar phase is like, you know what? You're now entering the dark moon. And you're like, but I'm supposed to be finishing grad school. It's like, nope, no, you're not.
All right, yeah. So have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own emotional life? And if so, what have you found? And here I would love to hear if you have any takes on the void of course moon.
Okay, so my thing on void of course moon is I'm real traditional about this because otherwise we'd have a lot of void of course moons, and I just don't think that's the case.
Hmm.
It really does need to be like it needs to be not making any aspects for 30 degrees at all.
Okay.
And I mean like really no aspects. So I'm very particular about that. And I will say this, I don't count that amongst the outers because the
Mm.
outers are such slow moving planets. And I do believe those are more generational and kind of forces that are maybe outside of just ourselves in that sense in the chart.
Hmm.
Obviously exceptions, like if it's angular or conjoined a planet or whatever, it'll modify things. Um, but like with void of course on like a day-to-day basis, I'm really going to look like, is it making an aspect, within so many degrees within this 24-hour period to
Hmm.
any of the 7 classical planets?
Yeah.
If the answer is yes, it's not void of course.
Hmm.
It might be, what I would say is it's kind of like it goes from being a symphony when it's making a lot of aspects to a lot of planets to being like a one kind of instrument moment, right? It's getting its solo.
Hmm.
And so, and we do see that, like when you've got, say, the moon is an aspect to Saturn and nothing else, all those Saturnian themes get dialed up and you can hear them really clearly for that day.
Hmm.
And even if it's just like by kind of like sign, you can still kind of feel that. So for me, void of course is really like it needs to be very precisely like 30 degrees, no aspects, then you really feel it. It's a dead zone.
Hmm.
It's kind of the same with like stationing retrograde planets. I find that the station, those days around the station are more impactful than the retrograde itself because the
Mm.
planet is slowing down. And so it's really not working according to what it should, right?
Hmm.
So void, of course, if the moon acts as the translator of light, and it doesn't make aspects for an entire like 24 hours with 30 degrees, you're going to feel that. Everything's going to come to a screeching halt. Nothing's going to happen the way that you want it to. Um, and then as far as tracking lunar cycles, I mean, that's a huge part of my practice because I'm also uh, esoteric occultist and being a very lunar person, I started paying attention to moon cycles like probably 5 or 6 years ago. Even before I got into traditional astrology, I would say, because I started really noticing the moon in particular places, and I will say that place is usually Aries, is not a good time for me.
Mm.
And I will say this, like anything that goes through Aries is not a great time for me because it makes a square to the majority of my charts, making this
Yeah.
giant T square. And it's in my 6th house, and it brings up like how like we had Jupiter in Aries last year, and I found out that I'm celiac in the hardest way
Oh
possible, and
gosh.
like all kinds of stuff. So I'm like, okay, great. It's not even about the planet, just anything in that house, anything, because Jupiter should be kind of nice, and it really, really wasn't. It was like a
Hmm.
explosion of inflammation in my body.
Oh.
So I started noticing that first with the moon. The moon would go into Aries, and I'd be like, oh, today is terrible. Today
Hmm.
is terrible. I'm tired. I don't want to do anything. And then, of course, I think other people who menstruate will probably realize that your period syncs up with the moon. And I started tracking that really carefully because I was like, what's happening here? Why does this keep happening on these particular moon signs?
Hmm.
Um, but it kind of developed beyond that, and it's part of my creative practice that I have, which is an almost daily thing. But I do always make notes about like the moon. It's such an elementary thing, and I think a lot of people don't do it because it's elementary. But my God, if you track the moon and what's going on with the moon, like I said, you're going to become like a pro astrologer in no time because it has such
Hmm.
a noticeable impact in your world every single day.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you did give that suggestion at the beginning to become a pro astrologer to track the moon. Do you have any other suggestions for people who are like new to forming, planetary relationship or new to astrology maybe, to like initiate and form a relationship with the moon?
So when it comes to the moon, and I would say this about any planet or star. First of all, go out and look at it.
Yep.
And go outside. The moon is amazing because unlike some of the planets or even the stars, it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in, unless you are literally under the cover of black smoke, you are gonna more than often than not, you're gonna be able to see it. And I think that that's a great way to have that kind of physical connection. The moon is the easiest one for you to track too. And you'll start to notice other things like, oh, well, when the moon is in this phase, it shows up on this side of the sky and also doesn't rise until later. Or sometimes I only see it during the day, and starts to kind of
Mhm.
change your idea of like why the moon in certain phases might have the meaning that it does when you start connecting
Mm.
it to that physical observation, because that's what the ancients were doing. That's why we have this whole system of stuff coming up. Um, the other thing is when we're forming planetary relationships, my advice is, and I taught this a long time ago when I was teaching, I called it Star Praxis. Ancient Astrology for Modern Witches is the first class I ever taught. Very ambitious. Basically, I will one day retool it to be animistic astrology, because that's really what it was,
Mhm.
with like some, witchy stuff thrown in, but it was about embodying astrology. And it was about, particularly every single week, we would go through and like you had an assignment for the moon.
Mhm.
And the moon would be like, we need to find a place that would be descriptive of the moon's qualities. We need to find a food that's descriptive of the moon's qualities. And this is so you can have that embodied experience in that relationship. And this is how we go for people who are into witchy or occult stuff. We go beyond correspondences you find in a book, because you start to realize what those qualities really are.
Mm.
And so what's really easy to do, if you want like a kind of like baseline of this, is you could go to skyscript.co.uk. It's a great resource. And you can click on the moon, and you can go to traditional significations of the moon, and you'll get these descriptions from William Lilly, because that's a great source to just get you started, where he talks about different places that kind of are assigned with the qualities of the moon, or foods that are assigned, or herbs that are assigned, right? And that way you can kind of go and be like, okay, I'm doing this moon relationship, and I want to have a physical experience that is emblematic, and I'm learning about the moon through the things that the moon signifies, through the relation the moon
Mm.
has with the world. Um, One of my favorite ways to connect with the moon of all time, also did a class on this, is gardening.
Mm.
Learning about growth and decay and the way that seeds germinate and when to feed them and when not. We have traditionally always done that by the moon anyways.
Yeah.
And I think at some point I'll make that as a recorded class you can buy, but those would be my top ones, is like, yeah, go do these things. That helps you with, I feel like a lot of astrology is like, let's sit down with a chart that has nothing to do with looking at the sky and read a book.
Mhm.
And I'm like, no, I want you to go out and live it. I want you to experience it. And you'll suddenly start to understand those qualities of the planet that you are in question of wanting to understand, because they're here with us
Mm.
all the time. They're here
Yeah.
with us whether or not we are aware of it. And what's great is that when you become aware of it, it actually enchants your world.
Mm. That's beautiful. Yeah, and powerful suggestions. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that you want to add? Do you have any imparting thoughts about the moon?
Oh my gosh. Um, High order.
What was that?
I said high order. We're 3 hours in. Let's
I know.
see.
I feel like we've done it, you know?
I feel like we've done it too. There's so much about the moon that we could literally probably go on for eons. So I'm gonna say, you know what? We're gonna respect what the moon is telling us right now, and that is the body going, spend 3 hours, and SP needs to eat, and I need to go see my family because it's late here in Ireland.
Mhm. Yes. So with that, where can we find you? And can you tell us what you're working on again, and anything that you'd like to share with us?
Okay, you can find me at moonhavenastrology.com. What I've been working on right now is actually guides for every moon phase.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that's been a big project that I've just been pouring myself into. Eventually, I'll release my eclipse guides. That'll be free. I was supposed to do it the last eclipse, but like I said, that eclipse was like, haha, you thought. Um, that's the biggest thing I'm working on. Obviously, I'm at the end of my fixed star readings, and so I'm trying to get through those. I might have made too much open schedule for that. So it's been a bit of a heavy month of consultations. And that's really the major thing, is those guides. And I'm giving this new reading called Lunar Rhythms. I have a shape-shifting reading, which is all about cycles, and we really are looking at those lunar progressions and what's going on in the life, but also looking at some of the timing techniques you and I talked about today,
Cool.
with the perfections and the solar return and what's going on with the part of fortune, just to understand where we are in our life and how to respond to it, and if we need to do some balancing with remediation as far as like what can we do to make this go easier and better for us.
Mm. A lot of great lunar offerings you got going on. Wonderful. Amaya, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate all the preparation that you put into this and like the generosity of time that you've shown. I really appreciate it a lot. It's been such a pleasure to meet you and talk to you today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Your podcast is such a wonderful balm, I think. People to talk about I think a lot of astrology gets theoretical, and you're like, have you experienced this? What is the lived sense of this? And I think that that's a gift. So thank you for doing this and putting yourself out there, because I did listen to your first one and how you were like, I don't know if I should do this or not. That balsamic moon is like, what if I just stayed dark? Like,
Yeah, my gosh. Well, thank you for that. That is really meaningful. Yeah, thank you so much. It's so nice to get the feedback and hear that people are enjoying it and that like it's contributing something. Means a lot. So thanks.
well, thank you for having me.
All right. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.